Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the northern lights flicker above you, frost creeps along the edges of the fjord, and somewhere in the darkness, a longhouse glows with firelight. Inside it smells of roasted meat, sweat, damp wool, and smoke. It's the Viking Age, and as romantic as those Instagram posts of people in fur capes might seem, you're about to find out that intimacy here isn't all misty moonlight and slow-burning passion. In fact, you probably won't survive this. Not the frostbite, not the feasts, and definitely not the bedroom politics. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, and the time of night or morning this finds you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is somewhere around 900 CE. You're standing at the threshold of a Viking longhouse in the dead of winter. The wind cuts like a blade, but inside the heat hits you instantly. Fire in the central hearth, a haze of wood smoke drifting along the ceiling beams, the air thick with the smell of bodies that haven't seen soap in months. Privacy here is a myth. The space is one long room, packed with benches, sleeping furs, carved chests, and people. Always people. Children whisper in corners, warriors sprawl near the fire. And somewhere in the dimmer edges of the hall, couples are curled under blankets, pretending nobody notices. And here's the first dark truth. In a society where survival depends on tight-knit households, your body is part of the communal economy. Relationships aren't just about feelings, they're about alliances, survival, and control. If your family needs a stronger ally against the neighbouring chieftain, congratulations, you're getting married next week. Whether or not you've even spoken to your future spouse, in many cases you meet them on the wedding day itself. That's not to say there's no romance at all. The sagas, those semi-mythic stories written down centuries later, sometimes speak of love matches, of couples who choose each other and fight against the odds to be together. But historians argue over how often that happened. Was it rare? Common? Or just a storytelling device to make a good saga? There's no clear consensus. Though what we do know is that arranged marriages were the norm, and affection, if it happened, often came later. Now imagine this. You've been on a freezing voyage for 3 weeks, rowing through sleet and darkness. You stumble into this hall with your crew smelling like seawater and dried fish. The feast begins, steaming mutton stew, horns of mead, the chieftain making a speech. Later, when the crowd thins and the fire burns low, you might find yourself in the arms of someone you've been eyeing all night. But here's the twist. In this world, intimacy is never purely personal. If the wrong person sees, it could spark a blood feud, or worse, a legal case. Viking law codes actually mention sexual slander. Accusing someone of certain acts could be grounds for violence or massive fines. Words were weapons here, as sharp as any sword. You shift in your seat, realizing the benches are arranged not just for comfort but for surveillance. Everyone can see everyone else. In a space where no door locks and the walls are thin, your love life is basically a public performance. Though not necessarily in a way you'd choose. Even the way couples sleep, sharing furs in communal spaces, means secrets are hard to keep. One wrong whisper in the mead hall, and your reputation could sink faster than a longship in a storm. Of course that doesn't stop people. The Viking Age wasn't puritanical, it was pragmatic. Sexuality was part of life as natural as eating or drinking, but also a tool for negotiation, alliance, and dominance. Wealthy men might have wives, concubines, and mistresses, all in the same hall. Women too could wield desire as political leverage, though with more risk, one scandal too many and they could lose their property or even their lives. And then there's the fringe fact most people don't expect. The sagas sometimes mention love poetry that was so powerful it could magically attract someone, or, depending on the listener, humiliate them into submission. In Icelandic law, writing or reciting certain kinds of erotic verse about a person could actually be considered an insult severe enough to warrant legal action. Imagine being dragged to court for writing a spicy limerick. By now, you're starting to feel the heat of the fire on your face, the press of bodies all around, the bass rumble of conversation. You're also starting to realise that sex here isn't hidden in shadows, it's woven into the fabric of social life, for better and for worse. The longhouse walls hum with it, just as much as with the songs, the boasts, and the endless gossip. You glance toward the far end of the hall where the chieftain's high seat is flanked by carved wooden posts. Behind them, Through a curtained alcove, you catch a glimpse of two silhouettes moving together. No one comments, they all know, and maybe even approve, depending on who's involved. Out here in the north, the rules are less about morality, and more about who benefits from your choices. Somewhere outside, snow begins to fall, muffling the world beyond the firelight. You sip your mead, your mind turning over everything you've seen tonight. It's not love as you knew it, it's survival wrapped in fur, bound by law, fueled by desire and watched by everyone. You wake to the sound of boots crunching over frost-hardened earth, the air cold enough to bite your nose before you even open your eyes. The longhouse is still dim. The central fire burned down to a few glowing embers, but people are already stirring. Today isn't about feasting, it's about a different kind of battle. One fought not with spears, but with marriage contracts. In the Viking Age, the bedroom was as much a warfront as the battlefield, and marriage could be a weapon as sharp as any axe. The chieftain's wife is already up, hair braided tight, eyes scanning the room with the precision of a commander. She's no passive bystander, she's the strategist behind half the alliances in this settlement. In Norse culture, women often had more say in marriage negotiations than you'd expect for the time, but their power was rarely romantic, it was transactional. A good match could secure land, ships, or warriors. A bad one could doom an entire family line. Picture two rival clans who've been feuding for decades, raids, burned farms, stolen livestock. The solution? Marry the chieftain's daughter to the son of the rival leader. You might think that would end the grudge, but sometimes it only paused the fighting until one side felt strong enough to break the agreement. Love had nothing to do with it. If you were the bride or groom, you were a pawn in a bigger game, and everyone knew it. One actual historical example: in the 10th century, Gunhild, known as the Mother of Kings, was said to have been married to Eric Bloodaxe, as part of a broader political strategy that boosted both their powers. She wasn't a quiet wife either. Later sagas portray her as ambitious, ruthless, and utterly aware of how to use her position to shape politics. Scholars still debate whether she was a real historical mastermind or a villain, inflated by later Christian writers to demonize powerful pagan women. Of course, not every marriage was about smoothing over blood feuds. Some were aggressive moves to expand territory. Marrying into a wealthy family could bring you the dowry of land, cattle, or ships, essentially absorbing their economic power. In that sense, the wedding feast was the signing of a peace treaty, or a declaration of intent to dominate. When you stand in the mead hall and hear the elders discussing matches, you might as well be listening to generals planning a campaign. Here's a quirky truth. Viking wedding processions could be as elaborate as military parades. The bride might be escorted to her new home with armed guards, musicians, and an entourage carrying her dowry. The symbolism was clear. This was a transfer of valuable property, and she was part of it. In some cases, her family would also hand over family heirlooms like swords or ancestral jewellery, as if merging bloodlines was a literal merger of assets. The darker side of this: consent was a flexible concept. A freeborn woman might be able to reject a suitor, though she'd need the backing of her family, but a politically necessary match could override personal feelings. If you refused, you risked alienating your kin or even causing open conflict. Men weren't always free to choose either. Sons could be married off against their will to secure alliances, though sagas suggest women had fewer escape routes once bound. Still, the sagas also hint at moments where individuals fought back. There are tales of brides fleeing before the wedding night, or lovers conspiring to avoid politically arranged unions. One story from the Laxdela saga tells of Gudrun Osvifusdottir, who navigated multiple marriages and divorces, seemingly always positioning herself to come out ahead. Whether she's remembered as clever or manipulative depends on who's telling the tale. Now you watch from your place on the bench as the chieftain meets with another elder by the fire. They speak in low voices about a possible match between his son and a merchant's daughter from across the fjord. On the surface, it's about uniting two households. In reality, it's about gaining access to the merchant's trading routes, which would mean more silver, more exotic goods, and more influence in the region. The son, currently busy trying to flirt with a thrall in the corner, has no idea his romantic future is being negotiated over morning ale. It's easy to forget, in the candlelit romance of modern Viking portrayals, that these people lived in a constant state of strategic alert. Every connection was weighed for its value. Every marriage proposal was a chess move. Even the wedding night, something you might imagine as private, was sometimes followed by public acknowledgement that the union had been consummated, sealing the alliance as binding. A small scholarly debate still swirls around how much individual Vikings cared about emotional compatibility in marriage. Some historians argue that love played a role more often than we think, pointing to sagas that celebrate passion and loyalty. Others insist those are idealised literary moments. With real-life unions driven almost entirely by politics and economics, the truth probably lies somewhere between alliances first, affection if you're lucky. The fire in the longhouse grows brighter as more people rise, and the smell of breakfast, flatbread and dried fish mixes with the lingering scent of last night's mead. Outside, the fjord glints under a thin sheet of ice. Somewhere in that frozen expanse lies the path to another settlement, another hall, another set of negotiations. In the Viking Age, love isn't something you find, it's something that's arranged, signed, sealed, and sometimes sharpened like a blade. The longhouse is buzzing by midday, and you notice a cluster of elders gathered near the central hearth. The conversation is about silver, livestock, and more delicately, people. Specifically, a bride. In Viking society, marriage was never just a union of hearts. It was a transaction, and like any business deal, there were year terms, negotiations, and a price tag. This was the bride price, and if you thought it was about romance, you'd be mistaken. Here's how it works. When a man wants to marry a woman, he doesn't just charm her parents with flowers and sweet words, he offers payment. Not to buy her exactly, but to compensate her family for the loss of her labour and presence. A freeborn woman was an economic asset. She worked the land, managed household goods, oversaw servants, and in many cases handled trade while her husband was away raiding. Losing her meant a real hit to the household economy, and the bride price munda was the man's way of saying, I can make up for that loss. In the corner you hear the metallic clink of silver arm rings being weighed. Silver was common currency in the Viking Age, measured not in coins but in weight, cut into pieces if needed. The payment could also be made in goods, fine cloth, weapons, livestock, or even land deeds. The higher the bride's status, the higher the munda. A chieftain's daughter could command enough wealth to set her up for life, or to ruin a man if he overextended himself trying to marry above his station. It's worth noting that the bride price wasn't the same as a dowry. The dowry was what the woman brought into the marriage, goods and property that technically remained hers, though her husband could manage them. The bride price, on the other hand, was given directly to her family, with a portion sometimes set aside for her own use if the marriage ended. And yes, divorce was possible in Viking society, though it was far easier for men to initiate. But here's where things get tricky. The bride price could turn into a hostage situation in all but name. If a marriage soured, the woman's family might be reluctant to support her leaving because returning the bride price, or a portion of it, could be financially ruinous. This meant some women were effectively trapped in unhappy or even abusive unions. The sagas hint at this reality, though often in roundabout ways because public acknowledgement of such situations could be politically damaging. One historical tidbit. In the Gragas law codes of medieval Iceland, there's detailed regulation on how much a man must pay for a bride depending on her social standing. These weren't vague customs, they were written into law, complete with penalties if the payment was insufficient or withheld. In essence, marriage was a legally binding exchange, and failing to uphold your side could lead to lawsuits or feuds. Now for the quirky fact, some bride price negotiations could get wildly specific. There are records of payments including exact numbers of sheep, certain lengths of imported silk, or even a prized hunting falcon. Imagine bartering for a spouse and insisting, I'll agree, but only if you throw in that really nice bird. As you sit in the longhouse watching the negotiations unfold, you start to see how these arrangements could drag on for days. The groom's family wants to pay less, the bride's family wants more, and both sides are careful not to insult the other. Too low an offer could be taken as a slight on the woman's worth. Too high could be seen as flaunting wealth, dangerous in a culture where jealousy often had sharp edges. Of course, behind the polite bargaining there's often tension. Maybe the groom's family can't actually afford the agreed price and plans to make up the difference with future favours or alliances. Maybe the bride's family knows this, but is willing to gamble on the match anyway. In a world where reputation is everything, it's not just the marriage that's on the line, it's the political balance of the entire region. There's a scholarly debate over whether the bride price was purely pragmatic, or if it also had symbolic meaning. Was it just economic compensation? Or was it also a public display of the groom's ability to provide? Some argue it served as a kind of guarantee of good faith, proof that the groom was serious enough to invest heavily. Others think it was nothing more than a socially acceptable way to turn people into assets. The fire crackles, sending sparks up into the rafters, and the smell of roasting fish drifts through the hall. The bride in question sits quietly at the far end, her expression unreadable. You wonder if she's secretly pleased with the match, or if she's calculating just how much she might be worth in silver and sheep. Either way, the decision is being made for her, her future traded like any other valuable possession. In the Viking Age, love may have been a luxury, but marriage, that was business. By afternoon, you've learned that in this world, the warm glow of the hearth doubles as stage lighting, and reputation is the play. You shift closer to the fire just as a pair of men square up over a whispered accusation. Nothing louder than a hiss, but in the Viking Age, a hiss can be a lawsuit. Here, desire isn't just private, it's legislated, priced and punishable. Passion has paperwork. Lust has a ledger. And the thing, the open-air assembly, has ears like a whole hillside of nosy grandmothers. If you want to survive, you memorize the rules. First rule, control the story. Norse law came at sex sideways, through honour, property and public words. Call someone unmanly Arga, or imply they took the female role during sex. And congratulations, you've committed one of the nastiest insults known to early Icelanders. That's not prudery, that's politics. Such an insult could justify a duel or a lawsuit, and the fines could ruin you. In some law codes, the slander alone counts as an assault on a man's legal standing. Swords bruise the body, words bruise the rank you stand in. Second rule, mind your verses. Erotic poetry is not just flirty, it's flammable. The Icelandic legal tradition, later written in the Gragas, treats certain kinds of love poems, mansongvar, as actionable defamation. Craft a clever stanza bragging about someone else's daughter, and you might find yourself paying compensation or dodging a spear, the quirky fringe bit. An especially rude poet might wind up lampooned back with an n-eyed verse, and for extra spice your enemy could raise a nidjdong, a curse pole topped with a carved horse head, or, depending on your local drama level, something even more anatomical to shame you and your kin. Imagine HOA rules, but with hex totem poles. Third rule, adultery is not a fairy tale plot twist, it's a legal time bomb. If a married woman is caught with another man, the penalties fall unevenly depending on the place and centuries, but a common thread runs through the law codes of Norway and Iceland. Someone pays. In the Gulathing or Frostathing laws, the wronged husband can claim compensation, sometimes from both the wife's lover and her family, because dishonour echoes across households. In Icelandic practice, the injured party might choose blood, but financially savvy people preferred silver. Cold comfort, but comfort still. Here's a grounded historical fact. In medieval Iceland, a woman could divorce her husband by following a formal script, declaring her separation first at the marriage bed, then at the main doorway, and finally at the household's boundary or the local assembly, each time naming witnesses and grounds such as, "he struck me," or "he withheld support." That choreography appears in the Gragas and echoes in saga scenes. It's not romance, but it's agency, performed step by step like law turned into theatre. Mistime a line, and the marriage might legally still stand. Precision matters when your freedom hangs on phrasing. The law squints hardest at ownership and obligation. Betrothals are contracts. Dowries and mourning gifts, morgengifu, are lines on the balance sheet. If promises are broken, say the groom vanishes with the munder still unpaid, or the bride's kin deliver less dowry than agreed, the case lands at the thing where elders, neighbours and rivals watch like ravens. Here, privacy means whispering just loud enough to be heard by the required witnesses. You swear oaths with hands on carved posts and eyes on the crowd. Truth is something the community decides to believe. What about assault? Pre-Christian and early Christian law in the North struggles to pin down consent the way modern courts try to do. It reads sex through damage, injury, trespass, violation of a guardian's rights. If a woman is forced, compensation tends to flow to her or her legal protector, and the sums can be steep, calibrated like Wergild for bodily harm. The result is grim arithmetic. Harm converts to silver, Whether that translated to real protection varies by time, place and power. The letter of the law offers one reality, the Longhouse pecking order offers another. At the fire's edge, you witness a quieter case. A farmhand is accused of fooling with a betrothed girl behind the drying racks. He swears it was just words, a flirtation with too much mead. But her brothers darken like storm clouds, because if even a rumour stains their sister's marriage market value, the price of the match drops or the alliance evaporates. So does the money. The thing becomes a courtroom where the evidence is mostly reputation, who saw what, who wants whom allied, who owes whom a favour. The verdict is often a settlement. Silver, a public apology, maybe the farmhand's sudden transfer to another valley, exotic concept, plea bargain by sheep. There's an open scholarly debate simmering beneath all this. Were these strict sexual statutes actually enforced as written? Or were they more like moral scarecrows, rules everyone nodded at while real power played out informally? Some historians argue that the sagas exaggerate courtroom drama for story value, and that most disputes settled quietly in private payments and handshakes nobody recorded. Others counter that the very detail of Gragas and the Norwegian law codes suggests a living legal culture that loved its procedures, with assemblies really serving as social pressure cookers. The truth likely sits in the smoky middle, a world where the law is both script and stage, but the richest actors improvise. You might be wondering whether jealousy ever had legal shortcuts. Occasionally, yes. The law preserves the idea that catching an adulterer, in the act, could justify immediate violence with lesser penalties, though standards of proof and the degree of leniency vary by code and by witnesses present. A rash husband who kills without the right audience risks trading a moment of rage for a lifetime as an outlaw. Timing, again, is everything. Even revenge has to respect the schedule, and then there's the Christian turn of the screw. As missionaries slowly gain traction, new sins seep into old systems. Priests push for regulation of consanguinity. No more marrying your near cousin just because it keeps the cattle close, and they frown on concubinage. Confession begins to nibble at the edges of what counts as a community matter versus a soul matter. But in the early phase, it's all blended together. A chieftain funds a church, a bishop blesses a treaty-like wedding, and the same old fines follow the same old feasts. Conversion doesn't erase desire. It relabels it and adds paperwork. Here's another oddity filed under fringe but not fantasy. Some cases hinge on where a body part crossed a boundary. Did the kiss happen inside the doorway or outside? Did the hand slip beneath the cloak or merely brush it? Laughter ripples at the thing when someone gets too specific, but people lean in anyway. Because lines matter. A step inside the threshold could shift a flirtation into actionable offence, just as a step across a field boundary turns friendly grazing into trespass. In this culture, doors do more than swings, they define. You breathe the resin-sweet smoke and watch as the elders finally break the tension. No duel, not today. The accuser withdraws the worst of his words. The accused pays a fine small enough to be bearable, but large enough to taste like defeat, and a poet in the corner quietly retires a saucy stanza that might have made things worse. The longhouse exhales. Knives slide home into sheaths. Mead returns to cups. Nothing is solved forever. Everything is settled for now. That's the rhythm. Desire rises, reputation wobbles. Law steps in with a measuring stick carved from oak and custom, and life inches on. You curl back toward the fire as voices soften. The rules feel claustrophobic, but they reveal something essential. Here, sex is never only sex. It's a claim staked in the public square, a speech act that can cost silver, a rumour that can end a feud or ignite one. You don't just keep your hands to yourself, you keep your syllables in line. In the north, a tongue can be sharper than an axe, and the law keeps count of every cut. The hall is quieter now, the earlier tension diffused into murmured conversation and the clink of drinking horns. Then the doors open and a gust of icy wind snakes across the rush-covered floor. A figure steps in, tall, with a round shield strapped to her back and a sword at her hip. Her hair is plaited into tight braids, her cloak pinned with a bronze brooch. The crowd glances up, some in respect, some in unease. She's a skjaldmare, a shield maiden, and she doesn't look like someone here to pour ale. The sagas are full of women like her, though historians argue endlessly over how much of that is truth and how much is longhouse exaggeration. Did women really fight in battles, or were shield maidens mostly legendary figures, like Brynhild from the Volsunga saga? The debate heats up every time an archaeological find, a warrior's grave with weapons and female skeletal remains, hits the news. Some scholars see proof that women sometimes took up arms. Others point out that burial goods don't always reflect the life someone lived. Still, whether or not every saga shield maiden fought, the idea of them had real cultural weight. And in this society, a woman who could fight could also negotiate her own place in the realm of desire. The shield maiden strides past the fire, removing her gloves, her eyes scanning for someone, maybe an ally, maybe a rival, maybe something else entirely. You notice the way some men look away, as if unsure how to treat her. She's not a thrall, not a chieftain's daughter, not a wife bound to the hearth. She's an anomaly, a woman with a sword in one hand and her own choices in the other. Here's the thing. Stories about warrior women often mingle romance with bloodshed. In Hervarar saga, Herva disguises herself as a man to lead warriors and later reveals her identity, shifting from battlefield to marriage market in a single lifetime. In Laxdæla saga, Gudrun Osvifusdottir never wields a sword, but her political manoeuvring shapes men's fates as much as any warrior's blade. The line between seduction and strategy is a thin one in these tales. Historically, women with autonomy, whether through widowhood, wealth, or martial skill, could sometimes bend the usual rules. A wealthy widow could refuse suitors outright, or choose one who offered political advantage. A woman rumoured to have fought alongside men might earn a kind of wary respect that let her move between male-dominated spaces. But there's also the darker side. Such women were often accused of being Argha in reverse, not unmanly but unwomanly, crossing the boundaries that defined proper female behaviour. In a society where honour was currency, even admiration came with risk. One fringe fact: Norse mythology loved to blur gender and power. The goddess Freyja is both the deity of love and of battle, riding into war in a chariot pulled by cats. Valkyries choose the slain in battle and serve mead in Valhalla, servants and sovereigns in one. For some Viking Age women, these mythic archetypes may have offered models for power that mixed physical skill and sexual agency. For others, they may have been cautionary tales, be fierce but not too fierce. The shield maiden in the hall sits across from a trader with weathered hands. They speak in low voices, leaning close over the table. You can't hear the words, but you can read the posture. This is a negotiation. It could be about a voyage, a share in some cargo, or perhaps a more personal arrangement. She smiles slightly and the trader shifts in his seat, caught between intrigue and caution. In a world where most women's relationships are arranged by family, here's someone making her own deals. But there's danger in that freedom. The law codes don't have special categories for women who live outside the standard roles. They get judged by the same metrics as everyone else, which means any whisper of scandal can stick harder. A shield maiden accused of seducing someone's betrothed or of sleeping with an enemy warrior might find herself at the centre of a thing-hearing, stripped of property, or exiled. The same boldness that wins her a place in a warband can also make her a target for gossip knives. Some scholars argue that sagas exaggerated the sexual independence of women like shield maidens to make them more dramatic, either to praise them as exceptional or to caution others against stepping out of line. Others suggest that these figures reflect real-life anomalies, women who inherited land, refused marriage, and defended their holdings by force. The truth may be somewhere in between, as it so often is with Viking history, part record, part romance, part after-dinner boast. The shield maiden finally stands, shakes the trader's hand and turns to leave. As the door swings open, a burst of snow swirls in, briefly erasing her outline in white. When it clears, she's gone, and the longhouse settles back into its usual rhythm. But you notice something. A few of the younger women are watching the door she walked through, as if imagining themselves with a sword across their backs. In the Viking Age, seduction wasn't just about beauty or words, it could sometimes be about the weight of your shield, the sharpness of your sword, and the audacity to walk into a hall and take a seat without asking permission. For some women, that mix of danger and desire was as intoxicating as mead. For others, it was the fastest route to exile. Either way, the shield maiden's shadow lingers in the firelight long after she's gone. The snow outside has thickened into a slow, heavy fall, and the kind that silences everything except the occasional crack of the hearth. Inside, the hall's light glows against the dark, and the conversation turns to a topic as old as the settlement itself. How many lovers is too many, and how many is just clever politics? Someone jokes about a local man with 2 wives and half a dozen headaches, and the laughter is knowing. But beneath the humour lies one of the Viking Age's most complicated truths. Multiple partnerships weren't rare, but they weren't always smooth sailing either. First, the basics. While most Viking Age marriages were monogamous in the legal sense, high-status men sometimes had more than one recognised partner. This could take the form of sequential marriages, divorcing and remarrying quickly, or simultaneous arrangements, especially if one partner was a concubine, frilla, rather than a full wife. A frilla could be a free woman, but often she was a former thrall or a woman from a captured settlement. The children from these unions could be acknowledged and even inherit, depending on the father's recognition and the local laws. Here's the catch. Polygyny wasn't a free-for-all. It was largely the privilege of men wealthy enough to support multiple households. Having more than one partner meant more than extra bedding. It meant more mouths to feed, more dowries to pay, more alliances to juggle. A chieftain with 2 wives might keep them in separate farmsteads to prevent open feuds. Even then, competition for status, especially for whose children would inherit the most, was constant. The sagas are full of these rivalries. In Laxdæla saga, for example, Höskuldr Dala Kolsson marries Jorun, but also takes Melkorka, an Irish princess turned thrall, as a concubine. The tension between the 2 women simmers under the surface, each asserting her dignity in different ways. Jorun retains the authority of the legitimate wife, while Melkorka works to secure a future for her son. Whether the saga's details are fact or fiction, they capture a truth about human nature in tight social hierarchies. 2 people sharing the same partner rarely keep things cordial forever. There's a quirky historical wrinkle here. Some law codes allowed a man to keep a concubine with his wife's knowledge, as long as it didn't threaten the wife's status. But the moment the concubine's children began to outshine the wife's, say in wealth, beauty, or political favour, the balance could tip into outright hostility. Inheritance laws could get messy, especially if a man died without clear testament, leaving sons from different mothers to argue over who got which farm or how much silver. Polyamory in the modern consensual sense is harder to find in the record. The Vikings valued personal honour and autonomy, but emotional transparency about multiple lovers wasn't exactly a celebrated virtue. If 2 free people openly agreed to share a partner, it probably happened more often in private than in public view, and it certainly didn't make it into the law codes. Instead, we see hints of complex arrangements in poetry where the boundaries between flirtation, insult, and actual relationships blur like ink in mead. Of course, the double standard loomed large. A man with multiple partners could be admired for his virility, while a woman doing the same risked accusations of promiscuity or dishonour. That didn't mean it never happened. It did, especially among women of power, but it meant that such arrangements had to be negotiated with extreme care. Wealthy widows, for instance, might keep lovers without remarrying, using their autonomy to avoid giving anyone legal control over their property. One fringe fact worth savouring: runic inscriptions sometimes carry what look like declarations of love from multiple admirers for the same person. On a stick found in Bergen, 2 different men left messages for the same woman, suggesting either a rivalry or an unusual openness. Whether that reflects everyday reality or just one peculiar situation is hard to say, but it hints at the possibility that the Viking world, for all its laws, wasn't entirely rigid about desire. Now, imagine you're sitting in this hall beside a man with 2 wives. He divides his attention with calculated care, complimenting one on her weaving, then praising the other's cooking, never lingering too long with either. The women smile politely, but you can feel the sharp edges in the air. In private, each likely works to secure his loyalty, not only for emotional reasons, but because it could decide the future of her children. In a society without modern banking, inheritance is everything. It's the guarantee that your bloodline will still matter a generation from now. Could still debate whether Viking Age polygyny was widespread or mostly confined to the elite. Some argue that archaeological evidence of multiple female burials in a single high-status grave site could indicate recognised co-wives. Others think such finds are more likely kin group burials. Written sources, being skewed toward the lives of the powerful, may overrepresent a practice that was rare for most. What's clear is that when it did occur, it came with built-in tensions, and plenty of legal and emotional manoeuvring to manage them. The fire pops, and someone near you tells a story about a man who tried to keep 2 wives in the same household, only to wake one night to find them standing over him with knives. The punchline earns a round of laughter, but it's the nervous kind, the kind that says, it could happen. For all the pragmatic talk about alliances and dowries, the human heart remains unpredictable, and in the Viking Age, crossing the wrong person in matters of love could be as fatal as crossing them in battle. By the time the storm settles into a fine white whisper against the turf roof, the talk in the hall has drifted, as it often does, to the future. Meaning to children. Not children as you picture them, sticky and sleepy and chasing a goat in circles, but children as lines on a ledger, anchors for land claims, guarantees that a name survives a winter your bones won't. In this world, your bloodline isn't a private scrapbook, it's your dynasty prospectus, and everyone reads it. You can feel it in the way elders say the names, not just Asgeir, but Asgeir, son of Ketil, son of Thorir, who took that valley with 6 men and a borrowed boat. One name opens a whole file cabinet of rights, wrongs, and IOUs. You're sitting beside a cradle hacked from a hollowed log, and the baby inside makes that soft hiccup noise that drags a smile out of even the grimmest warrior. The mother dozes, cloak pulled to her chin. The father, who's been projecting nonchalance all evening, keeps glancing at the doorway. He isn't just waiting for the weather to clear, he's waiting for the thing season, when he can recite this child into belonging. Because that's how it works here. A life matters when the community says it does, when the name lands, when the father lifts the child and claims it. Here's your crisp historical fact. In early Iceland, the law code later written down as Gragas lays out inheritance like a tax table. Property passes to legitimate offspring in calculated shares. Sons first, daughters after, with precise fractions. If there are no children, it slides sideways to siblings and upward to parents. There's no neat primogeniture, not yet. It's a pie sliced among heirs, and every slice is a potential feud. The calculus turns intimate moments into legal architecture. A child doesn't just rearrange the sleeping furs, it rearranges the farm. You see the obsession everywhere. A man with no sons paces like a caged wolf. A woman who's miscarried twice keeps her face stony at feasts to deflect the pity that tastes like poison. The morning gift, Morgan Gifu, that a husband gives a wife after the wedding night is not only a romantic token, it's an insurance policy for her and potential children. The bequeathing of a sword to a newborn isn't a cute photo op, it's a press release. State claimed, line continues, even love poems, when they're not getting you sued. Spin around fertility, fields and wombs as parallel metaphors, harvest and birth paired like twins. Rites stick to babies like burrs stick to cloaks. Before Christian baptism took over, a newborn might get the naming sprinkled with water, Auservatni, and the gathered kin would listen for the chosen name like listeners for the first bird in spring. A child named for a dead ancestor doesn't just borrow a label, it's thought to draw down that person's hamingja, the family's luck force. Like catching a spark from a banked fire. That's your quirky fact of the night. In some corners of the north, people believed luck and essence ran along family grooves, and names were like tracks that invited power to roll right in. Call a boy after his iron-willed grandfather, and maybe the kid stands up sooner, grabs a wooden sword earlier, stares wolves in the eye longer. Coincidence? Maybe. But coincidence with a good story always wins. There's theatre in paternity, too. A man may acknowledge a child by setting it on his knee, a gesture that looks simple and feels like thunder. Knee, name, kin, hin. 3 beats and the drum changes. Without that gesture or its legal equivalent, the future buckles. The child might still live in the household, might still be loved, but wouldn't automatically carve a slice of inheritance out of the farm's future. In a pinch, witness statements and oaths try to fix what an absent father can't, but it's smoother when the knee says yes. The anxiety that hums beneath the lullabies is hard to miss. You hear women trade herbs by the hearth, angelica and juniper, whispered like passwords, while old men note auspicious days in the same breath they used to talk about sowing barley. Pregnancy is a hazard run, and everyone knows it. A midwife's kit looks like a warrior's. Cords to cut, iron for protection, charms to bully back bad luck. If a child fails, closets of grief open silently. If a mother fails, the whole roofline sags. Inheritance tables don't show the gaps where people vanish, but the longhouses do. Fostering ties the web tighter. A chieftain might send his son to another household to be raised, not because he's indifferent, but because he's strategic. You put your boy under the roof of a man whose friendship you need, and suddenly that bond is thicker than winter stew. Foster brothers swear like blood brothers, and later, when someone's field boundary mysteriously migrates a few feet in spring, those oaths matter. A daughter fostered with a wealthy widow learns the art of keys and chests, while her own mother calculates how those skills convert to better marriage terms. Love and leverage share a cradle. You get your first whiff of the dark edge when the conversation lowers and eyes slide sideways. What happens when a child complicates the math? If a man dies with 3 sons by different women, and no clear instructions, the farm can cleave into crumbs. Cousins feud for generations over a strip of hay meadow, wide enough for a single scythe swing. Family trees here are not gentle, they're thorny hedges, and everyone gets snagged. Sagas record ankle-deep lists of forebears, not because authors adored genealogy, but because audiences needed to track who owed whom, what blood, and what acre. The Landnámabók, that great colonisation book of Iceland, unspools hundreds of names like a sail. Each thread is a claim, stitched to land and power. And now we step into the debate that keeps scholars sharpening their quills. How far did the obsession with lineage twist demographic reality? Some argue that the North practiced infant exposure more often than the texts admit, trimming family size or gender's balance in hard times. Others push back, noting that burial evidence for systematic exposure is thin, and that saga-era Scandinavians treasured daughters as marriage assets and household engines, not disposable mouths. There's also the question of sex ratios in skeletal collections, skewed by everything from preservation to grave-choosing bias. The consensus, unsettled. The data open like a door into sleet. You see shapes, not certainty. Meanwhile, the Christian tide keeps lapping at the old pillars. Priests emphasise legitimate marriage and baptism, snipping the wild edges off concubinage and post hoc acknowledgements. They push rules about who can marry whom, no more close cousins as a handy way to keep sheep and silver cosy together. But conversion doesn't erase the North's instinct to archive its people in memory. Churches simply offer new shelves, godparent networks, christening records, saints' days for birthdays. The name still lands like a ship at a known dock. The dock just has a cross carved on it. Back at the cradle, the father finally does the thing. He scoops the baby, the little bundle exhaling milk breath, and sets the child on his knee. The hall tilts toward him, the way a field of wheat leans with the wind, and he speaks a name that carries the room like a drumbeat. You feel the shift. Property lines redraw themselves in invisible ink. Future feasts arrange themselves 3 summers ahead. Someone quietly calculates whether this boy's claim could intersect with her granddaughter's dowry in a way that glues 2 farms into one. Another whisper of a fringe detail. Some households keep a carved ancestor pole tucked behind a chest, not for public display, but for winter nights when stories run thin. A hand rests on the carved face and a tale pours out. How great-grandmother bargained a river crossing with only a stare. How an uncle's luck turned after he donated a silver ring to a shrine. Whether the pole holds power or merely focus, nobody argues. Belief greases inheritance better than parchment. And you, face warmed by the hearth, realise the sharp heart of it. Here, bodies and boundaries are the same category. The blood in your veins is also a fence line, a path to court, a seat at a long table. Make a child and you mint a coin with your face on it. Fail to make one and your name becomes a footnote. In the Viking Age, desire wears a family crest, and every lullaby doubles as a contract. The hall is quieter than usual tonight. Not because the storm outside has eased, it hasn't, but because a certain kind of story has been making the rounds. You hear it first as a whisper near the fire, then again in the corner by the ale casks, until the mood in the longhouse settles into something heavy and knowing. It's about the thralls, the enslaved people who live among the free, sleep along the same walls, eat at the same fire, but whose bodies are not their own. And when the conversation turns to sex, the line between survival and violation blurs into something both brutal and ordinary. You've seen the thralls all day without really seeing them, hauling wood, skinning animals, mending sails, pouring mead. A thrall might be a war captive taken from across the sea, or the child of another thrall born into bondage. They can be bought, sold, given as gifts. If they're lucky, they might earn freedom after years of service, but most won't. And when it comes to sexual relationships, the rules are grimly simple. A thrall's consent isn't required. The master's will is the law. Here's the hard historical fact. In the legal codes of the Viking world, Like Norway's Glything law, a free man who sleeps with another man's thrall doesn't commit adultery. He's guilty of property damage, not moral trespass. The fine is paid to the thrall's owner, not to the thrall. The act itself is described in terms of use, not union. It's not that society pretended such encounters didn't happen, it's that it didn't even classify them as the same category of human interaction. The sagas mostly skim over this reality, but when they do touch it, the details are telling. A concubine taken from a raid might live for years in a master's household, bearing children who are legally his property. Those children could be freed, acknowledged, or sold depending on the master's whim. In some cases, a concubine's status could rise if the master favoured her, perhaps even freeing her and marrying her. But this was the exception, not the rule. There's a strange and chilling quirk here. Some wealthy men use sexual access to thralls as a bargaining chip. In certain alliances, offering a favoured thrall to a guest for the night was considered a form of hospitality, much like sharing the best meat or pouring the strongest ale. That doesn't mean every hall engaged in it, but the fact it existed at all shows how deeply dehumanised thralls were in the sexual economy. Imagine being a young woman from the Irish coast, captured in a raid, dragged north across the winter sea. You speak none of the language. Your clothes are gone, replaced by whatever the household spares. You sleep near the doorway in case you're needed at odd hours. One night the master calls you over, you know there's no choice. In the Viking world, this is not scandal. It's logistics. Tomorrow, no one will speak of it unless there's a child or a quarrel over ownership. The open scholarly debate here runs along jagged lines. Some historians emphasise that, despite the brutality, concubinage could occasionally offer a thrall better living conditions or the possibility of manumission. Others counter that framing it this way risks softening the reality that these relationships were built on coercion, not choice. Archaeological evidence, like the high percentage of women in burial sites interpreted as thrall graves, underscores how widespread and entrenched the practice was, but bones don't record consent, only proximity. A fringe fact, rare, but real. In a few sagas, a freedwoman who had once been her master's concubine becomes a power player in her own right. In Laxdela saga, Melkorka, rumoured to be an Irish princess, maintains her dignity despite her status as a concubine and secures a good marriage for her son. Whether or not she was a real historical figure, her story hints at the narrow paths some women could carve out of subjugation, using intelligence and patience to turn survival into agency. You glance across the hall to where a young thrall woman stirs a pot of fish stew. She moves quietly, eyes lowered, but you notice the subtle watchfulness in her posture, how she shifts away when a certain man walks past, how her hands tense when she hears her name. You realise that in a space this crowded, there's no true escape. Every relationship, wanted or not, is conducted under dozens of eyes. And yet, these women, and men, for male thralls, were also subject to sexual coercion, keep the hall running. They chop wood in the snow, tend animals in the sleet, carry messages between settlements. They're close enough to hear every whispered plan, to know which alliances are real and which are brittle. Some learn to use this knowledge as leverage, trading information for lighter work or protection from other threats. It's a dangerous game, but in a world where your body is a commodity, information might be the only currency you can hide under your tongue. The fire pops and sends up a spray of sparks. Someone starts a song about a long-ago raid, and the hall's mood shifts toward the familiar warmth of mead and memory. But the stories about thralls linger like smoke that doesn't leave the rafters. This is the part of Viking life the sagas don't romanticize, the part that sits at the uncomfortable center of survival and exploitation. Here, desire isn't just tangled with power, it's built into the foundation stones of who has power at all. By morning, the wind has swung around from the west, and carrying with it a briny tang that makes every head in the hall turn. Out beyond the headland, dark shapes crawl along the horizon. Longships, their curved prows cutting through the foam. At first, you think it's traders returning home. Then you see the painted shields, the spears bristling along the gunwales, and the shouts rising as the village scrambles to the shore. These are raiders, and they are not here to barter. You follow the crowd to the beach, where the first ship grinds against the shingle. The men leap out, iron helmets catching the pale sun, axes swinging. Their faces are smeared with soot and salt. The defenders, armed with whatever they can grab, form a line, but you can already see how this will go. The clash is quick and loud, splintering steel on steel, the thud of boots in wet sand. and behind the violence another reality unfolds, one that will carry back across the sea in the holds of these ships. The raids are not only about silver, livestock, or slaves to work the farms, they are also about captives taken for another purpose entirely. Women, especially young ones, are prime targets, not because of some Hollywood fantasy about Viking romance, but because they can be brought home as concubines, married off to cement alliances, or sold in slave markets from Hedeby to Dublin. For the raiders, this is a secondary harvest, human, not grain, but just as valuable. Here's your stark historical fact. The annals of monasteries and chronicles from the British Isles make repeated mention of Viking attacks where women were carried off. These weren't rare incidents, they were built into the economic logic of raiding. Slavery was a key part of the Norse economy, and sexual exploitation of captives was a predictable extension of that system. Norse law treated foreign captives as property, meaning their bodies could be used or traded without legal consequence for the captor. From the deck of a ship heading home, the sound of the village fades, replaced by the steady creak of oars. Captives sit bound along the benches, guarded by men whose laughter is easy and unhurried now that the danger is past. You can see the different ways they react. Some stare into the water, silent. Others watch the horizon, their faces tight with calculation. A few meet the raiders' eyes with a defiance that draws either grudging respect or sharp blows. Every one of them knows the odds. Some will end up in farms far inland, others in port towns, and some in the halls of men who take them as concubines. The sagas, when they touch this subject at all, sometimes dress it in the clothes of myth. A woman taken in a raid might later be described as having come willingly, or as a gift from one chieftain to another. It's the kind of narrative smoothing that makes later audiences forget the violence underneath, but archaeology, with its cold bones and DNA analysis, has been less polite. Graves in Scandinavia have yielded remains of women with isotopic signatures, showing they grew up hundreds of miles away, sometimes as far as the British Isles or the Baltic. Strong evidence that they were taken from their homelands. A fringe fact to consider. In some cases, a captive woman might marry into the community that took her. This could happen if she bore children to a high-status man or if her beauty or skills made her a valuable household member. That marriage could grant her a measure of security, but it was still born from the asymmetry of capture, not free courtship. Whether she found real agency in that role depended on her status within the new household and her ability to navigate its politics. There's an open scholarly debate about how widespread sexual violence was during raids. Some historians argue that while it certainly happened, the primary goal of raiding was economic, plunder, not pleasure, and that sexual exploitation was a byproduct rather than an objective. Others point out that in societies where sexual access to captives was normalized, the distinction between byproduct and objective is more rhetorical than real. Either way, the cultural framework made it possible, and the stories of those taken rarely survive except in hints and silences. You picture the long voyage back, a ship rocking under the weight of stolen goods and stolen people. The crew tells bawdy jokes, sings snatches of rowing songs, sharpens weapons for the next fight. Somewhere between the sound of waves and the smell of pitch, a young woman stares northward, toward a land she's never seen but will soon call home, whether she wants to or not. She doesn't know yet if she'll spend her life under a master's roof, serving at his table and in his bed, or if she'll be traded like amber or fur to a stranger inland. By the time the ships slide into their home harbour, the raiders are already dividing the spoils. Silver and furs are counted, livestock is driven off, captives are brought to the longhouse for inspection. The process is brisk, efficient, nothing about it framed as cruelty. In this economy, everything is either a resource or a liability, and the people taken in raids are no exception. The hall's mood is celebratory, the mead flows. For the captives, the future narrows to a point, and the choices ahead belong to someone else. The fire inside crackles louder than the sea outside. But you can still hear the rhythm of the oars in your head, the steady pull that brought these new faces here. In the Viking Age, the line between desire and domination was often the length of a ship's voyage, and once you crossed it there was no going back. By dusk the hall has the quiet of a stage before the curtain rises. Benches scrape, horns thud down. People shift to make an aisle that points like a spear toward the high seat. This isn't a feast, or a council of war, or a merchant's handshake. Tonight the longhouse becomes a courtroom, and the case is the one nobody admits to liking but everybody listens to, adultery. In this world, the bed can put you on trial as surely as any battlefield, and sometimes it decides who sleeps warm and who sleeps cold forever. You can feel the temperature change when the accused walks in, a man with sea-calloused hands, cheeks wind-burnt, eyes refusing to meet anyone's. A woman follows, her hair neat, linen immaculate, jaw held at an angle that says she's picked her line and will die on it if she must. The husband comes last, flanked by brothers who look like they've already chosen the verdict they want. There's a hum in the rafters, the kind that builds when a village draws a knife and calls it a question. The law here names the offence whoredom, and it doesn't treat it lightly. Not because the gods hate romance, no, because property, inheritance and honour snag on it like cloaks on nail-heads. A wife accused of infidelity pries open every lock in the house. The legitimacy of children, the flow of dowry and mourning gift, the worth of alliances bound by marriage. The man accused stands to pay fines, lose standing, maybe face outlawry if the husband claims the right situation, caught in the act, or the right witnesses, or simply enough momentum of anger to tip the thing his way. First speeches, the husband's kin lay out the chain, a cloak found where it shouldn't be, whispers in the smokehouse, a door latch lifted softly when it should have shouted. The supposed lover had been seen near the yard at moonrise, boots crusted with the same mud that stains the back step. The wife's advocates lift their chins and answer with precision. The cloak was borrowed, the door latch sticks, the mud is everywhere this time of year. Rumour is not law. The hall nods, because everyone knows rumour is almost law, but not quite. Here's your clean historical fact. In Iceland's legal culture, later written down in Gragas, cases like this went before assemblies organised into courts. The Althing hosted quarter courts, and when those snarled into deadlock, reforms in the early 11th century added a fifth court to untangle them. Litigation wasn't a sideshow, it was the main event of civic life. Legal procedure, summons, witnesses, oaths, unrolled in set beats, and a misstep could sink a winning case. The law wasn't a mystery. It was choreography, and everyone in the room had heard the steps since childhood. The steward of the assembly calls for witnesses. First a neighbour who says he heard breath and bed reeds whispering after midnight, a sound not like sleeping. Then a thrall girl, hands worrying the hem of her dress, who fetched water and saw the lover slip behind the woodpile. Her voice trembles. Not from uncertainty, but from the knowledge that every word she says passes through a filter of status. She is property in a case about property, a human whose testimony must fight for weight against freeborn men's squints. Now the defence, the wife speaks, not loud but flinty. She was ill that night, her sister slept beside her, the lover was there to bring the medicine from the healer. She meets eyes one by one, nobody blinks. The supposed lover, who has kept his jaw clenched like a trap, finally opens it. He recites the formal denials, his oath braided to the names of witnesses and gods, careful not to stumble on a word that could turn sacred syllables into a lie. He adds the risky bit. The husband has a motive, he says. There's a land dispute coming. An accusation like this could push the wife's dowry back toward her kin and untie the husband's claim to an adjoining pasture. In other words, watch the silver behind the scandal. The hall hums again. There's a quirky practice hanging like a ghost behind tonight's argument. The hall can almost feel it, even if nobody quite dares to invoke it. In some places and times, communities leaned on what you might call trial by bed frame, proof of bed customs, sheets displayed, witnesses to the wedding night bedding, tokens of consummation treated as legal exhibits. While not a fixed ordeal, the way hot iron was in other parts of Europe, the North loved its thresholds and textiles as stand-ins for truth. A shift with telltale stains could shore up a claim of consummation in disputes over whether a marriage held. And that same logic, cloth and witness, sometimes seeped into accusations like tonight's. It's not that the law demanded such props, it's that people trusted them the way a village trusts a fence because it's been there forever. The real bite comes when someone mutters the old rule about catching an adulterer in flagrante, that if a husband surprises the act, he can strike with reduced penalty. Lesser outlawry, a fine halved, the usual dance of law bending toward rage. But that's only if the timing and the witnesses are right, and no blood was spilled tonight. The husband knows it. He's chosen the slower knife, litigation, open debate time, and it isn't just whispering academics who host it. Even here, you feel the tension in the sources, the sagas, the codes, the practices that changed with Christian influence. How often did these cases end in literal death, rather than negotiated fines? Some scholars argue the North preferred silver to slaughter, that outlawry and compensation were the pressure valves keeping feuds from boiling over. Others counter with episodes grim and specific where jealous husbands killed and paid little for it, especially when the community quietly agreed that honour demanded blood. The record is a fogged window. You see shapes, but every household breathes its own weather on the glass. A priest, new to this coastline, hands soft but eyes hungry for relevance, asks to speak. He quotes that marriage is a sacrament, that hearts should be judged in confession as well as in courts. A few men look bored, a few women listen with interest. One old farmer smiles because he remembers when these talks sounded exotic, and now they just sound like another layer of rules. The priest suggests penance for all, the accuser for anger, the accused for scandal, the hall for enjoying the show too much. It's a brave sermon in a room that still measures sin in cattle. When the time comes for oaths, the room leans forward. Oath-takers step to the high seat pillars, lay hands on carved wood dark with finger oil, and speak in steady cadence. An oath here is not a private promise, it's a public performance with penalties attached. Break it, and you don't just offend the gods or God, you hand your enemies a future lawsuit packaged with a bow. The wife's voice never wavers. The lover's voice cracks once, then hardens. The husband's brothers exchange a glance that means, we can live with fines, we can't live with shame. The verdict slides out like a blade from a sheath. No killing, compensation, yes. The alleged lover pays a fine for trespass of honour, not fully admitting guilt, but acknowledging the storm his closeness caused. The husband takes back part of the mourning gift pending a year's peace, a legal booby trap that springs if more whispers hatch. The wife demands, successfully, that her dowry remains intact, since no proof has pierced the threshold of certainty. Everybody wins and loses a little, which is to say, everybody survives. A fringe thread tugs your attention as the hall breaks into smaller conversations. An old woman mutters about laying an oar across a marriage bed to cool it. An old seafarer's charm turned whole household ritual, meant to keep sailors' wandering luck from crossing the threshold with them. Superstition? Probably. But even the practical North salted its law with charms, because sometimes you need to feel like you've done one more thing to secure the future. After the crowd thins, the wife steps outside alone into air that stings. Snow whispers over packed earth, and the sea answers from somewhere dark. You watch her square her shoulders as if she's putting armour back on. Inside, the husband negotiates with his brothers about cattle numbers tied to the settlement. The supposed lover palms the fine like a hot coal and disappears into the blowing flakes. You realise that the point of nights like this isn't truth in the absolute, it's balance. The bed is a battlefield because the household is a fortress, and the law is a set of ladders and ropes for both defence and retreat. Back at the fire, two boys quietly reenact the scene with carved figures, one standing on a stool to be the law speaker, the other wrapping a scrap of cloth around a stick to be the bed. They giggle, but they're practising more than play. In a few winters, they'll be the ones standing beneath the rafters, fingers on carved wood, breath steady, words precise. And they'll know what you know now. In this place you don't just keep a clean home, you keep a clean story. If your bed is a trial, your life is your testimony. Speak carefully, live carefully, and always count your witnesses before you close the door. The hall smells of wet wool and salt when the next story drifts into the circle by the fire. It starts as a half-joke from an older man, the kind people tell to test the air before revealing something that might stick. Back in my youth, he says, there was a shepherd who didn't care which way the wind blew, so long as it brought company to his bed. The laughter is uneven, but the point is clear. Not every Viking Age romance followed the neat lines drawn in the law codes or the sagas. Some bent them quietly, some broke them outright. And though the record rarely spells it out, there are hints of love and lust that didn't fit the man-woman marriage mould. Archaeologists have sometimes stumbled across these hints, like a boot finding a hidden stone, a comb inscribed with a man's name found in another man's grave, a runic stick in Bergen that reads like a flirtation from one male hand to another, saga passages where two men's relationship is described in terms that flicker between sworn brotherhood and something warmer. These scraps are few and far between, but they suggest that same-sex attraction existed here as it does everywhere, though how it was understood and how it was judged is a knot still tangled in scholarly debate. Here's your firm historical fact. The insult arga, or its variant ergi, one of the worst slanders you could throw in Viking Age Scandinavia, implied not only cowardice or moral weakness, but also that a man had taken a sexually passive role. In this warrior culture, that was coded as an attack on his honour and masculinity, and it could be grounds for violence or legal action. The insult didn't criminalise same-sex activity outright. It criminalised the loss of status associated with certain sexual roles. That's a telling difference from later Christian laws, which condemned the act itself as a sin, regardless of context. The sagas give us glimpses that are easy to miss unless you're looking for them. In Gisla Saga, there's a pointed insult exchange between two men that implies a sexual accusation. In Njal Saga, Njal is mocked for being beardless and overly domestic, with an undercurrent of sexual slander. Yet these jabs only work as insults because the possibility existed in the cultural imagination. If no one ever crossed those boundaries, there'd be no need to guard them so fiercely. A quirky fact: the Norse gods themselves didn't follow rigid human sexual codes. Loki, the shapeshifter and trickster, famously transformed into a mare, mated with a stallion, and gave birth to the eight-legged horse Sleipnir. Odin, chief of the gods, was sometimes accused by rivals in myth of practicing Sida, a form of magic associated with women and considered unmanly. If the divine could bend and cross boundaries, it's reasonable to suspect the human world reflected a quieter, less mythic version of the same. You imagine the shepherd from the old man's story walking the sheep paths with another young man, their talk easy, their eyes lingering in a way that's not about trading lambs or land. They'd have to be careful, too public and it becomes a weapon for rivals, too private and it becomes a secret that shapes every choice they make. Maybe they arrange hunting trips that last a little longer than needed, or volunteer for the same distant voyage. The sagas are filled with journeys where companionship is the real cargo. The open scholarly debate circles around whether Viking Age Scandinavia had any space, legal, social, or cultural, for consensual same-sex relationships without stigma. Some argue that while the legal codes protected masculine honour from slander, they didn't actually outlaw relationships between men unless tied to that insult. Others note that the Christianization of the region, beginning in the 10th century, layered new prohibitions and moral frameworks over older norms, making it harder to tell where pagan practice ended and Christian moralizing began. The thinness of the record leaves both sides working from fragments, like reconstructing a song from two remembered notes. And what of women? The sources are nearly silent. Female-female intimacy doesn't seem to have been a focus of legal codes, perhaps because it didn't threaten the patriarchal structure in the same way male-male accusations could. That absence is a double-edged sword. It could mean it wasn't stigmatized, or it could mean it wasn't considered significant enough to be recorded. A few later medieval texts from outside Scandinavia suggest that women accused of such relationships could be shamed or punished, but whether that applied in Viking Age culture is uncertain. A fringe fact: in the 14th century Icelandic Kjalnesinga saga, there's a minor character named Thorgrimr the Witch, who lives with another man, Thorstein. The text never names them lovers, but their domestic arrangement is close enough to raise eyebrows in modern readings. Whether that's an echo of an older norm or just a quirk of the saga's author, it stands out as one of those rare moments where the narrative leaves a gap you can't help but fill. Back in the hall, the old man's story winds to an end. He claims the shepherd lived to an old age, never married, and left his sheep and silver to a friend who had shared his roof for decades. Some listeners chuckle, some just nod, and a few look into the fire as if weighing the space between what's said and what's known. In this world, the truth of such a life might never be spoken outright, but it could be lived if you had the right mix of caution, loyalty and luck. The fire hisses as someone throws on a damp log. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, and you think about how many kinds of love and desire have existed in this cold land. Some sanctioned, some hidden, some celebrated in the private language of two people who never needed the thing's approval. In the Viking Age, the heart could wander in ways the law didn't quite see, and sometimes that was the only kind of freedom worth having. The storm lifts the next day, and the hall exhales into a softer rhythm, men mending nets, women tending looms, children weaving between the benches like smoke. Outside, the snow has a faint crust, sparkling where the sun hits it. But in the shadowed corners of the settlement, the frost holds tight. That's where you hear the whisper. Someone's muttering about a certain woman down by the shoreline who knows ways to make a man fall for you or fall ill, depending on the payment. The air between the gossipers carries a hum that isn't quite fear, and isn't quite admiration. In the Viking Age, love could be a battlefield, but it could also be witchcraft, literally. The Norse called it cider, a type of magic often linked to prophecy, fate-weaving, and the bending of minds and wills. While cedar could be used for healing, cursing, or finding lost things, it also had a special place in the realm of desire. With the right chants, charms, and rituals, a skilled Seidkona, a woman practitioner, could supposedly make someone yearn for you, pine until they couldn't eat, or feel shame and weakness if they'd spurned you. Whether this was sorcery, suggestion, or just the power of a good story depended on who was telling it. Here's your grounded historical fact. The sagas and Eddic poems are peppered with references to magical love spells. In Egil's saga, the poet-warrior Egil Skallagrimsson carves runes to cure a sick woman, only to find someone else had previously carved harmful runes trying to win her affection. In Skirnismal, a poem from the Poetic Edda, the god Freya's servant uses threats, curses, and magic to coerce a giantess into marriage. These aren't warm, candle-lit love spells, they are coercive tools, folded into a worldview where magic and manipulation often went hand in hand. A quirky fact, some archaeological finds suggest charms could be quite literal, small amulets carved with runes meant to attract love or lust. A bone stick found in Bergen bears runes that read like a plea to think of me, love me, blurring the line between heartfelt note and magical compulsion. Whether these worked is beside the point. Belief in their potential was enough to make them dangerous, but magic came with rules, and breaking them could burn you. Practicing cedar, especially if you were a man, risked being labelled Arga, the same insult used for unmanliness and sexual passivity. That's because cedar was seen as a feminine art, involving ritualized behaviour and symbolic submission to spirits. Odin himself was accused in myth of this unmanly practice, a charge that underscored both the power and the social risk of using magic to influence desire. For women, the danger was different. A Seidkona could be accused of cursing, seducing, or destroying households, and that could end in exile or execution. You imagine her now, the woman they're whispering about, standing on a cold rock by the shore, cloak pulled tight, muttering to the waves. Maybe she's grinding herbs in a stone bowl, angelica root for attraction, rowan berries for protection, bits of bone char for binding someone's bill. Maybe she's carving runes into a strip of driftwood, sending it down the tide toward the one she means to ensnare. The sound of the sea covers her words, but the villagers will notice if, the next day, her target starts following her with the eyes of a sleepwalker. The scholarly debate here is thorny. Were these love spells taken seriously as real supernatural acts, or were they just a culturally sanctioned way to explain attraction, infidelity, or sudden illness? Some argue that the spells were psychological tools, rituals that heightened suggestibility, reinforced by social belief. Others see them as genuine attempts to call on unseen forces, part of a cosmology where gods and spirits were as present as the wind. Either way, the consequences were real enough if you were accused of them. One fringe detail from the Vatnsdæla saga lingers in your mind. A woman named Thordis is accused of using magic to keep her lover faithful, a charge that becomes leverage in a larger feud. Nobody can prove the spell worked, but the accusation alone damages her standing, showing how sorcery could be as much a weapon in politics as in romance. Back in the hall, someone starts telling a tale about a man who tried to hire a Seidkona to win over a married woman. She agreed, but instead of giving him the promised charm, she cursed him with impotence for being so foolish. The listeners laugh, but the nervous kind, half worried the punchline might have really happened, half worried it could happen to them. The firelight makes faces flicker in and out of shadow, and you realise magic here isn't just about herbs or runes, it's about narrative. If enough people believe you have enchanted someone, you might as well have, because their behaviour will be judged through that lens. Love in the Viking Age could be chosen, bargained for, taken, or whispered into being on a night when the waves are loud enough to hide the words. The hall is loud again tonight, but not with the warm noise of feasting. This is sharper, voices cutting across each other, the sound of mugs thumping against wood in irritation rather than celebration. At the centre of it is a man standing too close to another man's wife, and there's kind of sideways glances that turn into something bloodier if nobody steps in. In the Viking Age jealousy didn't just bruise egos, it could split skulls, and when it did, the weapon was just as likely to be a battle axe as a cutting remark. It starts small, maybe a lingering look across the fire, maybe a compliment that slides a little too far into suggestion. In a tight-knit hall where every movement is seen, nothing goes unnoticed. The husband notices, the wife notices him noticing, the crowd notices both. In this culture, desire is rarely private, and jealousy, once sparked, spreads like mead spilled on a rush floor, fast, messy, and sticky with the consequences. Here's your hard historical fact. In the sagas, jealousy is a common spark for feuds, and not just between lovers. Family honour was bound up in sexual reputation, so an insult or suspicion could pull entire kin groups into conflict. In the Njal saga, accusations of infidelity and improper advances fuel a chain of revenge killings that stretch for years. The law allowed for fines and settlements, but the sagas show that many preferred blood payment, especially if they felt public humiliation outweighed the value of silver. A quirky truth. Jealousy could even be stoked intentionally as a tactic. In some saga accounts, rivals deliberately made flirtatious comments to another man's wife in public, not to win her, but to provoke the husband into rash action that would justify a killing or a lawsuit. This weaponized jealousy turned courtship rituals into landmines. Tonight, you watch as the husband finally stands, his shoulders square and his hand drops to the axe at his belt. The man he's staring down, a trader from another fjord, keeps his hands visible, but his smile is thin. The wife looks from one to the other, her face a mask that says this isn't about me anymore, because it isn't. In a hall like this, once the crowd has scented a possible duel, the individuals at the heart of it become pieces in a larger game. The open scholarly debate here is whether Viking Age men were genuinely more violent in response to jealousy, or whether saga authors exaggerated these moments for drama. Archaeological evidence of weapon injuries supports the idea that interpersonal violence was common, but not all of it can be tied to love or sex. Still, the narrative patterns, accusation, insult, escalation, are too consistent across sagas to dismiss entirely. The stakes are higher for women in these stories. A woman caught in the middle of a jealousy feud could lose her standing even if she had done nothing wrong. If the husband prevailed, she might be forced into another marriage or lose property in the settlement. If the rival won, she might find herself relocated to his household, regardless of her feelings. In this world, jealousy doesn't just rearrange relationships, it rearranges lives. One fringe detail: some households practiced what might be called preventive measures against jealousy. A husband travelling for trade or war might leave a trusted relative or sworn brother to guard his wife, not as a jailer, but as a social buffer. The presence of a third party could dampen gossip or discourage advances. Of course, in saga fashion, there are also tales where the guard himself becomes the rival, which rather defeats the purpose. Back in the hall, the two men are now close enough for breath to mingle. The law's path here would be mediation, witnesses stepping in, fines calculated, honour satisfied through public words. But the crowd's appetite is leaning towards spectacle. You can feel it in the way people shift, leaving a space between the benches. In Viking culture, a duel could settle a question quickly, but the settling often left one party dead and both families simmering. The wife finally speaks, her voice cutting through the noise like the crack of a log in the fire. She doesn't plead, she accuses. She says the trader has mistaken her politeness for invitation, and that her husband is wasting his strength on a man who isn't worth his steel. The insult lands as intended. The crowd laughs, but the laughter is aimed at the trader now. His smile collapses. In a culture where public shame can be as deadly as a wound, he knows he's lost this round without blood. Later, you see him slip out into the night, his footsteps quick in the snow. The husband sits again. The hall's energy slowly returning to normal. But you know this isn't over. Viking feuds don't always explode right away. They can smoulder for seasons, waiting for the right time to reignite. The firelight catches on axe heads and brooches, making the whole room glint like a field of ice under the moon. You realise that here, jealousy is never just an emotion. It's a weapon, a challenge, a test of how much respect you can command and how far you're willing to go to defend it. In the Viking Age, a jealous glance could be the first step toward a blood feud, and a careless smile could be the last peace you ever know. The feast begins with a thud. The first keg rolled in, the second, then a third, like drums calling the valley to attention. Smoke braids up through the rafters. Fat hisses in iron pans. The longhouse warms until you can peel off your cloak and let your shoulders drop. Tonight isn't about raids or lawsuits. Tonight the benches become market stalls, and the wares are gossip, glances and futures. You feel it the way you feel a tide turning. This is the Mead Hall marriage market, where songs grease the wheels of negotiation, and a well-timed joke can be worth more than a wagon of silver. Seating is strategy. Elders take the high spots near the chieftain, where their nods carry weight. Eligible sons are planted where they'll be seen. Good light, good laughter, within earshot of the women who will carry tales home. Daughters float like clever fish, never still either. Always where conversation is richest, weaving between cousins and aunts who know exactly when to tug an elbow and say, "Meet so-and-so's boy, he keeps a tidy ship." You sit midway down the hall, a good vantage point to watch how the night arranges itself like pieces on a game board. The horn circles, first to the queens, then to ancestors, then to boasts. Oaths ride the foam like ships, promises to win a horse race in spring, to build a new byre by midsummer, to bring home a better catch than last year's. Watch the timing. A young man roars a pledge, and an aunt across the fire raises an eyebrow that says, "Perfect. Now he's marriageable. At least he thinks he can finish things." A quiet girl laughs at his swagger, then glances toward her mother. A fraction of a nod means, "You may speak to him, but keep your wits. In this room, flirtation is a team sport with coaches on every bench." Here's your grounded historical fact. Public drinking rites and oath-making were a real feature of Scandinavian feasts. The ceremonial chieftain's cup, the braggerfuls could accompany vows and boasts, and law culture loved witnesses. Betrothals themselves were contracts requiring guardians, gifts, and named onlookers. In Iceland, later written law made those elements explicit. A promise spoken in the right hall with the right ears is not just romance, it's enforceable social reality. A wrong word is a legal pothole, a right one is a cobblestone on your road. The meat lands in courses big enough to feed a saga, joints of mutton, slabs of pork, roasted fish with the nettles. Between bites the real business hums. A mother just happens to ask a boy about his pasture, letting him say the word 5 cows loudly enough for another mother to hear. A father accidentally praises a neighbour's daughter's weaving within reach of a trader who owns half the warp-weighted looms this side of the fjord. Compliments here are currency. Exaggerations are interest. Silence is a debt you might regret keeping. Somewhere near the high seat, an old boar's head makes a ceremonial circuit, bristles gilded with fat and light. A few men lay hands upon it and murmur vows for the coming year, a local twist on Yule customs that some say binds promises tighter when sworn on the boar. That's your quirky fact. Medieval sources remember swearing great oaths on the Snarg altar, the sacrificial boar at winter feasts. Whether the gods care is one debate, whether people behave differently after swearing with grease on their palms is another. Either way, tonight's boldest boasts get anchored to tusk and tradition. You catch a pair of girls by the door making a wicked sport of the parade. That one, good teeth. That one, better cows. That one, a mother with sharp elbows, dangerous. Their laughter is soft, but their evaluations are precise. It's easy to talk as if men trade women like cargo. But watch closely. Women do a lot of the trading here too, whispering networks into place, nudging negotiation guns toward allies they actually want near their hearth for the next 20 winters. Then the singing shifts and the air thickens. A man offers a song to a woman across the fire, too bold, riskily poetic, and you can feel people decide in real time if this is charming or a lawsuit in the larval stage. Remember the earlier rule about love poetry. One saucy line too many, and the wrong father has grounds to haul you before the thing for defamation. You can practically see the singer counting syllables, dodging the line between praise and implication. He lands it safely, barely. Her smile is measured, also barely. The chieftain's wife makes her move. She slides through to conversations like a needle through cloth, knotting threads. She praises a young widower's winter stores, where a certain girl's uncle can hear. She remarks that a merchant's ship came home earlier than expected, with fewer cracked ribs than last season. Code for, he's prudent, not just lucky. She inquires after a cousin's missing sheep, which is apparently also code for, don't marry into that mess. Their fences leak. In an hour, she has repositioned 3 futures and used nothing but compliments, questions, and one strategically delivered slice of honey cake. There's an open, scholarly debate about how formal these market nights really were. Did Viking-age communities hold structured bride shows as some later medieval writers suggest, complete with parades and immediate choices? Or are those stories Saxo, we're squinting at you, literary flourishes pasted onto older, messier customs of courtship at feasts and seasonal markets? Archaeology shows gatherings, trade fairs like the ones linked to winter festivals and regional things, where people from scattered farms collided. Whether girls literally lined up to be chosen, or whether the choosing was a long, smoky dance of glances and oaths spread over seasons, remains a lively argument with more footnotes than certainties. By the third horn, the room is warm enough to loosen even the stiffest shoulders. A shy boy tells a joke well. A girl who has spoken barely a sentence all winter produces a surprisingly sharp one, and earns a wave of approving clucks from the Aunt Brigade. You notice small gifts changing hands, an amber bead, a strip of dyed wool, a little knife with a carved bone handle. They're not bride prices, they're feelers, tokens that say, I see you, and I'm asking if the rest of your household sees me too. A low clap summons hush. The chieftain rises and calls two families forward. Everyone to pretend surprise. Nobody is surprised. The fathers speak first, then the mothers, then mercifully the pair at the centre. They don't have to shout, they just have to be heard. He says he will set a morning gift aside, 3 milk cows and a share in the old hay meadow. She says her dowry brings a chest of linens and a half-claim to a small woodlot. Witnesses step close, names are spoken, hands brush the high-seat pillars. It's not a wedding, not yet, but it's a shape. The hall murmurs its approval like a tide against pilings. Your mind flickers to the debates that never quite rest. How much room did affection have in this? Enough to matter? Too little to count? The sagas sing both ways. Rash lovers hurling themselves into ruin, steady matches warming into devotion over years of chore and winter. Modern scholars pluck at the threads. Some say economics set the warp and feelings wove the weft, and others argue that even the warp had soft spots where two people could nudge it with laughter and stubbornness. Looking around this hall, you suspect both are true. The ledger comes first, but within its margins, people scribble hearts. Someone starts the round of would you rather that always comes after the serious bits. Would you rather marry for a ship or for a field? For a quick tongue or a quiet hand? The answers are jokes mostly, but the listening is serious. Even the thralls tilt their heads as if to catch a detail that might matter later. Servants know the currents of this house better than anyone. A young thrall woman who has learned caution the hard way allows herself a half smile when the shy boy asks for a wife who can out-argue me so I don't drown in my own boasting. That's either a good line or a true need. Possibly both. The night thins, benches soften, a harp threads the spaces between cups. The chieftain's wife tucks a sleeping child's foot back under a blanket with the same hand that signed 3 agreements and blocked a 4th without saying no once. You catch the bride to maybe be, leaning toward her maybe husband, speaking low. Their faces don't show passion, they show concentration. The small furrowed brows of 2 people doing math no one else can see, and how many sheep equals 1 winter of peace. How many winters turn strangers into partners. No law code answers that. Only time does. Your last picture of the night is small and bright. A grandmother catches her granddaughter's sleeve and presses something into her palm. A little silver ring bent from a hacked-off arm ring. For luck, she says, and for bargaining. The girl hides it in her sleeve, eyes shining. Somewhere above, the rafters hold a century of smoke over a soot-dark archive of every promise sworn here. They will hold tonight's too, heavy with mead and maybe, if the gods or God are listening, mercy. Morning comes in bright stripes through the smoke hole, and with it a new sound in the settlement. A bell. Not a huge cathedral clang, just a small bronze voice, clear as ice water, stitched into the day by a priest with travel dust on his hem. He stands outside a timber-framed chapel that wasn't here last winter, a rough cross carved from the same spruce that once held up a bier. People drift toward it like they do toward any novelty. Curious, suspicious, a little amused. Tonight's talk, you can already tell, won't just be about who pairs with whom, it'll be about who blesses the pairing, and what exactly counts as blessed. Priests, pagans, and pillow talk are about to share the same bench. You feel the shift most in the pauses. Before, a flirtatious joke was a matter for the family and the thing. Now you hear it rerouted through a new gate. Ask father what he thinks, someone says, and the room ripples. The priest is young, keen-eyed, and practicing a smile that fits a longhouse. He knows he has to sell the faith in spoonfuls. Don't smash the gods, out-organise them. He praises good weaving and sharp ploughs, He sneaks in talk of sacraments like a cook sneaks salt into stew. And when a couple glances at each other across the hearth, he's suddenly near, warm and calm, as if he's always been part of such glances. Here's your crisp historical fact. In Iceland around the year 999-1000, the law speaker Thorgeir Ljósvetninga Godi, after lying under a cloak to think, declared the island Christian at the Althing with compromises. Public pagan sacrifices were out, private practice could linger for a while, practical peace trumped purity. Similar transitions played out across Norway and Denmark, with kings like Olafur Tryggvason and Olafur Haraldsson pushing baptism while still navigating chieftains' power. The result in bedrooms? A long negotiation where old customs bumped shoulders with new rules, and no one admitted how awkward it felt. The priest cultivates that awkwardness into order. He talks of marriage as a sacrament, one man, one woman, lifelong, and you can feel half the hall doing quiet math. What about concubines, so common among the rich that you can trace lineage by them? He doesn't ban the word frilla, he sputters it. He urges honour to the wife, legitimacy for children, and clean conscience, which sounds noble, until you realise it also means fewer legal routes for women to leave miserable matches. Divorce, once a matter of performance and witnesses at door, bed and boundary, gets fenced off behind church walls that don't have many doors. But the North is stubborn. Concubinage doesn't evaporate because a bell says please. It slides into the corners where law and life are blurry. A chieftain keeps the woman not called wife, and the priest frowns, the chieftain funds a new chapel roof, and the frown softens into a pastoral chat about eventual regularisation. Children from such unions might be baptised, their status nudged by confession, coin and time. The culture knows how to live with contradiction. The church learns how to invoice it. Quirky fact for your pocket: penitential booklets, those early medieval sin price lists imported with the faith, came with sex calendars so crowded you'd need an abacus to track them. No marital relations on Sundays, fast days, Lent, Advent, Ember days, eves of big feasts during menstruation, pregnancy, 40 days after birth. You get the idea. A diligent couple could theoretically spend half the year in pious small talk. Whether the fjord valleys observed every line is dubious, but the idea that beds had holy seasons catches on, and suddenly there's a new kind of gossip. Who's too cheerful on a Friday? The practical changes sneak in where you live. Betrothal, o festar, formerly a binding contract hammered out by guardians, starts to lean toward a church doorway for its seal. Weddings shift from home hearths to thresholds with crosses over them. The Morgan Gifu, that next morning gift once as secular as salted fish, collects a blessing and a record in a priest's hand. Names of witnesses move from memory to ink. With ink comes memory with teeth. Miss a step, and your neighbour's cousin can quote it at you with the smugness of a man who has heard a sermon. Open scholarly debate? Plenty. One knot ties itself around pace and depth. How quickly did Christian sexual norms actually bite into Scandinavian practice? Some scholars argue for a long twilight, 2-3 centuries, when legal texts said one thing and farmhouses did another. Concubinage and easy separation stubbornly alive under fresh paint. Others point to charters, court cases, and bishops' letters as proof that church discipline sank hooks faster than romantic retellings allow, with inheritance and legitimacy reforming within a few generations. The evidence flickers like firelight. You can read it as slow burn or quick sear depending on which corner you watch. Another knot is kinship. The church's bans on marrying close kin extend far beyond earlier practice, at some points to 7 degrees of consanguinity, a cousin maze where nearly everyone in a small valley is too close. Suddenly a match that keeps fields tidy is spiritually tangled. Workarounds bloom, dispensations for those with silver and standing, strategic fostering to blur lines, sometimes a we didn't know shrug until a priest appears with a list and a stare. Land maps and family trees start to squabble, and desire becomes a cartographic problem. You watch a small scene that says more than a sermon. The priest sits with a young couple and their kin, the table between them strewn with breadcrumbs and nervous fingers. He speaks gently about confession, about starting a household with clean hearts. The girl studies the wood grain, the boy nods too quickly. An aunt asks a sharp question about inheritance if the boy has another household shadowing him. Translation: an unofficial partner. The priest's mouth tightens, then relaxes into, "We regularise what we must," everyone hears. "Bring what you've hidden, and I will name it in ways that make it legal, and God will be pleased. and I will note it in my book. Books are new here, they make shadows crisp. Meanwhile, pagan threads aren't cut, they're rewoven. Fertility rites don't vanish, they change costumes. The old field blessings that once invoked Freya and a phallic plough now parade under a cross with holy water sprinkled where ale once splashed. A bride who used to sit on Thor's stone might now sit on a church step while a relic, chip of saint or splinter of somewhere, rests under her pillow. A grandmother mutters the same old rhyme to keep the evil eye off a newborn, then adds a paternoster for camouflage. The priest pretends not to notice, or notices and files it under Pastoral Realities Volume 1. You catch the whisper economy shift around sex too. Before, the worst slanders were about ardour and shame in roles. Now, unnatural acts arrive as a category with a capital U, smuggled in from Latin texts. The North translates slowly and selectively, but the path is set. Sins of the body migrate from public insult to private confession, from lawsuits to whispered tariffs of penance, bread and water fasts, alms, pilgrimages you postpone forever. Desire gets new paperwork. A small, sharp moment. A widow with serious keys at her belt, land, livestock, labour, tells the priest she will not remarry. He advises the sanctity of marriage. She advises the sanctity of not relinquishing her property to a second husband. He suggests a vow of chastity. She suggests a vow of minding his own hayloft. Compromise. She endows a lamp for the chapel and promises to live modestly. Everyone wins except the man who hoped to annex her meadow by proposing in spring. Fringe fact to tuck by the fire. In a few corners, local custom-blessed beds with travelling relics. A priest would lay a scrap of cloth said to have touched a saint atop the marriage pillows, murmur a prayer and pocket a fee. No thunder rolled, but couples slept easier, and if a baby arrived under that cloth within a year, godparents gained bragging rights forever. Skeptics called it holy bed-making, believers called it insurance, everyone called it preferable to feuding over a doubtful heir. By night, the chapel bell is a small memory, and the longhouse voice grows again. Yet you feel a new braid in the hum, law, luck, and liturgy twisting the same rope. Couples still angle their hands to brush under blankets. Aunties still bargain with cake. The chieftain's wife still moves futures with a sentence. But there's a ledger now that doesn't live only in heads, and a young man in a dark cassock learning how to read this place so he can write it down. You lie back on the bench and listen to distant water against the shore, thinking how conversion feels in a bed. Fewer exits, more blessings, fewer public songs, more private math, less shouting at the thing, more soft questions in a wooden chapel smelling of pitch and snow. Desire doesn't vanish under a cross any more than a river vanishes under ice. It keeps moving. The surface changes, the current learns new paths, and in the morning names will still be spoken, rings will still be weighed, and someone, priest or not, will still ask, who witnesses this? By late winter, the nights stretch long enough that every scrap of gossip seems to echo twice before it fades. The latest to circle the hall is about a marriage bargain gone sour, not over love, or even land, but over what changed hands when the couple wed. The phrase dowries of fur and flesh slips into the conversation like a knife through a cloak, and you learn quickly that in the Viking Age, a wedding wasn't just about who stood beside you, it was also about what you could carry, herd, or sleep beside when the feast was done. The Heimanfylgja, or dowry, was the wealth a bride's family sent with her into marriage. It could be land, livestock, clothing, household tools, jewellery, anything that added to the new household's prosperity. It stayed hers in theory, though her husband could manage it. In practice, whether she could touch that wealth again depended on his honour and her leverage. This was separate from the munda, the bride price paid by the groom's side to hers, and from the morgengifu, the morning gift the husband gave his wife after the wedding night. Each of these was its own layer of economic and symbolic exchange, and woe to anyone who mixed them up in a contract. Here's your grounded historical fact. In the Icelandic Gragas and Norwegian law codes like the Gulathing, the dowry was meticulously recorded because it determined the financial stakes in divorce. If a marriage ended, the wife was entitled to her dowry back, along with any agreed portion of the morning gift, but not the bride price. That stayed with her family. This legal clarity made marriage less a romantic union and more a series of overlapping business deals, all of which had to be witnessed to stick. Furs played a starring role. In a climate where warmth was survival, a dowry heavy in reindeer or fox pelts wasn't just a luxury, it was security. A wealthy bride might arrive with chests of imported beaver from the east or fine squirrel skins from the Baltic trade, each pelt soft enough to whisper her family's status without saying a word. Such wealth could tilt alliances, but so could the flesh part of the phrase, human labour. A bride's dowry might include thralls, male or female, whose work and bodies in many cases would serve the new household. That's the brutal edge. For high-status unions, gifting a thrall wasn't just about adding an extra pair of hands to the loom or the plough. It could also mean tacitly gifting sexual access, especially in households where concubinage was normalised. A thrall woman arriving as part of a dowry could be used by the husband, his relatives, or even guests, depending on the household's norms. This wasn't scandalous in Viking eyes, it was property management. For the woman herself, it meant a life entirely shaped by the marriage contract she had no say in. Quirky fact, not all flesh in a dowry was human. In some regions, gifting particularly fine breeding animals, especially mares or milk cows, was considered a sign of serious commitment, and the animals could be named in the marriage contract alongside gold or land. Saga writers loved to mention famous animals in this context, as if to remind readers that wealth was as much on 4 legs as on 2. You picture a winter feast where a bride's dowry is laid out for all to see, bolts of dyed wool stacked like snowdrifts, a line of fat cattle stamping in the cold, a cluster of thralls standing in a shadowed corner. The guests murmur appreciatively, some counting values in their heads, others gauging what political debts this wealth might call in later. The bride herself sits between her mother and an aunt, face neutral, hands folded over a lap full of embroidered cloth she may have stitched herself, cloth that will now belong to a man she may have spoken to only twice before. The open, scholarly debate here focuses on just how binding these economic terms were in practice. Some argue that the legal precision of dowry records points to real enforcement. If a marriage ended, families fought hard to reclaim every promised pelt and plough. Others suggest the reality was messier. Records might exist, but power decided what was returned. A widow with strong kin might reclaim her wealth. A wife without allies might see it swallowed into her husband's estate without recourse. Fringe detail. A few sagas mention dowries that included objects with rumoured magical properties, amulets, carved staffs, or blessed weapons. Whether this was literary flair or faint memory of actual practice is hard to say, but the symbolism is clear. You aren't just bringing material wealth into the marriage, you're bringing fortune itself. Back in the hall, the story behind tonight's muttering spills out. A local man married last summer, and his wife's dowry included 2 prized weaver thralls. Over the winter, one died of sickness, the other ran off with a trader. Now the husband is pressing her family for replacement value, arguing the contract promised a set number of skilled hands. Her family counters that dowries are like weather. Once given, the risk is yours. The priest, of course, smells a chance to mediate, for a fee. The thing will likely hear the case come thaw. You watch as the wife crosses the room, her face carved from ice, her shirts whispering over the rushes. She stops near her husband but doesn't speak. The room hums with the unspoken truth. In this society, the wealth that comes with a bride can make her more valuable or more vulnerable. Either way, it ties her to the fortunes of her new household as tightly as any vow. The fire snaps, and the smell of roasting meat curls through the air, almost enough to hide the iron scent of tension. Around you, conversations resume, but the numbers are still being counted. In the Viking Age, marriage is never free. Someone always pays, sometimes in silver, sometimes in fur, sometimes in flesh, and sometimes the debt comes due long after the feast is over. The hall is restless tonight, and you can tell before you even step inside that something ceremonial is brewing. Benches are being shifted, blankets shaken, the hearth piled high with fresh logs until the flames lick toward the rafters. People are already talking in low tones about the rekkjardómur, the trial of the bed frame. It's not the kind of trial where anyone dies, but in its own way, it can decide the fate of families, fortunes and reputations. It's the strange and sometimes awkward business of proving a marriage has been consummated. In the Viking Age, marriages were contracts, economic, political, and social, and like any contract, they weren't considered fully binding until the terms were fulfilled. For marriage, that meant more than just a public feast and exchanged gifts. It meant the couple had shared a bed in a way that could, in theory, produce heirs. Without that, a union could be challenged or annulled, and the flow of property, alliances, and legitimacy thrown into question. Here's your grounded historical fact. In some Norse-influenced legal traditions, especially in Iceland and parts of Norway, disputes over whether a marriage was valid could hinge on testimony that the couple had indeed lain together. The evidence wasn't physical examination so much as public ritual and witness accounts. The idea wasn't unique to the North. Other medieval cultures also used bedding ceremonies, but here it could be tied directly to inheritance rights. If a rival claimed the match was never consummated, they could undermine claims to land or break an alliance entirely. Quirky fact, in certain contexts, friends or relatives might accompany the couple to their bedchamber after the wedding feast, sharing a drink in the room, or even sitting nearby while the newlyweds lay down together. They weren't there for voyeurism, they were there to serve as living witnesses that the two had been placed in the same bed, under the same blanket. Whether the couple actually went further in that moment was less important than the symbolism of the scene being observed. Tonight, it's not exactly a wedding night. This couple has been married for weeks, but a rival kin group has been whispering that the bride still sleeps apart, suggesting the match isn't real in the eyes of the gods or the law. That's dangerous talk in a community where legitimacy determines whether your future children in Nuremberg will get brushed aside as bastards. So the husband's family has called for a public bedding, half ritual, half legal demonstration. You watch as the bed is dragged into the centre of the hall. It's a simple wooden frame covered with thick furs, tucked near the fire so the room's eyes can reach it. The couple enters together, faces carefully composed, and the crowd hushes. Two elders speak the old words about unity, about households joined, and then step aside. The couple sits, then lies down fully clothed side by side and under the same covering. The moment is brief, but it's enough. People nod. The necessary witnesses will swear to it later, and the challenge to their union is blunted. The open scholarly debate here is whether such bed trials were common in Viking Age Scandinavia, or whether they're mostly a survival of broader medieval European customs. The sagas mention bedding ceremonies more in passing than in detail, often assuming the audience knew the form. Some historians argue that the practice was primarily symbolic, a formality to silence rivals rather than an actual test of intimacy. Others think it carried more weight, especially in disputes where powerful families had a lot to lose if the marriage fell through. A fringe detail from later medieval Icelandic law says that if doubt still lingered after a bedding ceremony, the couple might be questioned separately about the marks, or the marriage bed, how the bedding was arranged, what words were spoken, even what side of the bed each lay on. The answers didn't have to be graphic, they just had to match. If they didn't, the rumour mill could start again. Back in the hall, the couple rises, smiling faintly, and the tension eases. The witnesses will remember what they've seen, and the rivals will think twice before pressing the matter. The rest of the night shifts back to normal, drinking, trading tales, the occasional flirtation in the shadows, but the bed frame still stands near the fire, a quiet reminder that here, intimacy is as public as it is private. You sip your mead and think about the strange duality of it. In the Viking Age, proving a marriage wasn't about romance, it was about politics, law, and the steady hum of survival. Love might be whispered in the dark, but legitimacy was lit by the hearth for everyone to see later. When the laughter drops into a drowsy murmur and the bed frame ceremony has been pushed back against the wall, someone pulls a narrow bundle from a chest and lays it beside the fire. It's a roll of small things, slivers of pine and birch shaved thin as tongues, a rib bone sanded smooth, a broken comb dark with age, a few palm-long sticks nicked with tiny straight lines. In the glow, the cuts catch light like frost. You run a thumb along one and feel the shallow grooves, angular, deliberate, like a roadmap for whispers. Around here, words don't always live in mouths. Sometimes they're carved into wood, bone, or stone, where they can keep speaking long after the speaker has moved on. And some of those words are not about cattle or saints or weather. Some of them are about the way a person feels when a certain other person walks into a room. A young man, ink on his fingers, splinters in his cuffs, leans close to you. "Runar," he says, almost reverently. "Runes go." He picks up a pine sliver and tilts it to the fire. The letters are sharp as thorns, no curves, just slants and staves that look as if they were invented by trees for themselves. He traces them, low voice translating. Not a blessing, not a tally, a want. Remember me, love me, think of me. It's not the only stick like that. He has a handful, bits of flirtation, fragments of longing, A couple of insults so rude they make a few listeners snort into their cups. Here's your grounded historical fact. In medieval Norway, Bergen especially, archaeologists dug up hundreds of runic sticks from the old waterfront, many carved with everyday messages, shopping lists, business notes, jokes, prayers, and yes, love lines bold enough to blush a priest. The dates skew later than the High Viking Age, often 12th to 14th century, but the language and habit belong to a Norse world that grew straight out of these smoky halls. Desire there wasn't only sung in skaldic verse, it was scribbled on pine and tucked in a sleeve. The young man flips to a rib bone, the white dulled by time, and taps at a tidy band of runes. Owner's mark, he says, plus a line that's either pious or flirty, depending on where you breathe. It's a running joke among rune readers that a sentence can tilt from devout to indecent with a single stroke. The letters don't have punctuation the way you expect. Meaning is a game of spacing, habit, and hearing the writers grin through the cuts. There's a quirky fact to the pocket. In more than one find, a comb carries a name and a nudge. I belong to so-and-so, remember so-and-so, kiss so-and-so. Combs were intimate tools, kept close to the body, and a sweet line on a comb was a portable flirtation, a promise you could run through your hair. Sometimes the messages are taunting, sometimes tender, sometimes both, because the North likes its laughter salted. The carver pulls out a short stubby stick blackened at one end. From a hearth edge, he says, people use whatever scraps they had. The runes here are clumsy, like a first try, and the words come out more desperate than poetic. If you won't look at me, may you not sleep. It's half love note, half curse, and you feel the ice spark of it, the way longing can slip toward malice if it knocks too long without an answer. You ask if this is magic or just writing, and the hall divides its face, one side practical, the other gleaming with old superstition. The answer is both. Runes are letters, tools for names, numbers, receipts, laws, but they're also older than that in the northern mind, carved with the expectation that wood and bone listen differently than air. The word you cut is the word you anchor. The word you wear against your skin is the word that works. Our historical footnote curls right here. The little word alu shows up on amulets and objects across the north in the earlier Viking Age, a charm element whose meaning scholars wrestle with. Ale, protection? Power? Whatever it meant exactly, people thought it did something, and it shows up alongside symbols meant to fortify luck, health, maybe even desire. An alu scraped into a drinking horn might be a joke. The same on a pendant tucked under a tunic might be a private plea. Make me potent, make me pleasing, keep me remembered. The open scholarly debate is a many-headed thing. How literate were ordinary folk with runes? Were these love sticks everyday notes by a broad slice of people, or the work of a handful of restless carvers offering their words to others like charms for hire? And when a line looks erotic, are we reading hunger into ambiguity, translating with modern hearts instead of medieval ones? The Bergen finds give us volume, enough flirtations and scurrilities to say it wasn't rare, but there's still argument over how far back the habit runs and how far down the social ladder it reached. Women's hands may have carved some, owner tags and domestic notes hint they did, but the evidence is a shy thing. First-person names aren't always the writers, and bones don't say who held the knife. The carver produces a sliver of birch with a faint, tidy hand. This one, he says with a smile that goes a little sideways, was tucked into a weaving tablet. The letters run neat along the edge. Think of me as the thread passes. It's tender, almost shy, and it smells of loom rooms and wool dust. You picture a woman working a warp-weighted loom, the beat of the weft like a heartbeat, and that secret line riding every pass of the shuttle, turning cloth into a letter you can wear. If that isn't spell work, it's the next closest thing. Fringe detail whispered with a wink. In a few digs, rune cuts ride the shoulder blades of animals, the flat bones used for everything from soup to quick notes. Some are plain labels, some look like curse bits or love bits, tossed into the fire after reading as if the smoke carried the message out to the fjord. Call it scapular mail. It's not a system, it's a mood. Words you can't keep in your mouth any longer, sent up where only the gods or the wind can catch them. The older men by the fire who sang all the lawsuits earlier can't resist chiming in. One quotes the law about mansongvar, those love songs that could be treated as defamation if they name names and implied acts. Write the wrong thing, he says. And you don't get a kiss, you get a fine. He waggles his cup at the runesticks. These are safer, private, unless someone finds them in a chest 50 winters later and reads you out loud for the whole hall. Everyone laughs, and then everyone glances at the bundle like it might start gossiping on its own. The carver lays out one last piece, a tiny pendant of whalebone drilled for a cord, corners rounded smooth by thumbs. The runes are short. The message shorter, 2 names tangled with a charm word. You can feel the talisman quality of it. This was meant to be worn under a tunic, warm against skin, a small stubborn hope pressed to a breastbone all day. In a life where marriages are bargains and beds are trials, a little portable wish is the size people can carry without dropping it. Outside, frost creeps along the door planks like white lichen, and the sea keeps its steady throat song. Inside, a small argument hatches about meaning. One woman insists a certain line is naughty. A man says it's just a pun about fish. Another woman, who's watched 3 daughters marry and survive, says it's both, because the best lines always are. This is the scholars' debate made domestic. Do we translate with blushes or with ledgers, with fieldwork or with jokes? The truth is, these little artifacts hold several truths at once, and the hall is perfectly used to living with that. You roll one stick between your fingers, feeling the way the cut edges catch and release. You think about how writing shifts desire from breath, which vanishes, to wood, which doesn't. A whispered invitation can be denied, a carved one has to be explained, forgiven, or answered. That makes carving brave. It also makes it dangerous in a world where the wrong line could follow you to court. The carver finally reties his bundle, knots quick and tidy, and tucks it back into the chest beside spare lamp wicks and a little twist of dyed thread. The hall eases into low talk, the kind that sits with you like warmth after strong drink. Somewhere beyond the wall, a fox yips, then another answers from the hill. You lie back and feel the bench under your shoulders, the nervous happiness of a message sent and not yet returned. If you listen, you can almost hear the soft scrape of a knife point at the far end of the room. Someone is making letters in the half-dark, risking a fine, a chuckle, or a kiss. Maybe they'll wedge the sliver under a pillow. Maybe they'll hide it in a shoe. Maybe they'll burn it and ask the smoke to carry what they can't dare to say aloud. In this place, love is a lot of things, contract, quarrel, lullaby. But it is also a handful of straight lines cut into wood, small as a secret, sharp as a promise. The sea gets inside your clothes first, salt stiffening the wool, wind threading your hair into knots, that damp chill that finds your bones no matter how many furs you stack. You're wedged on a sea chest beneath the awning, knees touching somebody else's knees, shoulders forever negotiating elbow treaties, and the longship flexes like a living thing. Every few moments a wave slaps the strakes with that hollow wooden thump, as if the ocean is knocking. Still in there? Still trying? No one would call this romantic, but you can feel how boredom and nearness start to braid themselves into possibilities. The longhouse had eyes, the ship has none, but it has ears, wind, rigging, gossip, so you still move carefully. Day 1 at sea is all enthusiasm. Oars beat time, the sail bed's in, everybody jokes about the first one to throw up. Day 2 turns the air to iron filings and your stomach to a grudge. By day 3, rhythm set. Watches and wayfinding, bailing and bailing, eating when you can, sleeping when you must. Privacy is a campfire story. You learn the choreography, cloak accidentally draped where it makes a little tent, a shift to the lee side to share wind shadow, a muttered conversation about rope that is not about rope. You're not fooling anyone, except maybe yourself, but people pretend, because the sea punishes drama and rewards quiet. Here's your clean historical fact. Viking-age ships weren't all razor-thin war snakes. Those are the longships for speed and raiding. Trade and colonization leaned on Nara, broad-bellied cargo vessels with crews smaller than warboats but still noisy enough to drown a whisper. A Nar might carry 20 or so souls plus livestock, timber, and the kind of barrels that make new settlements possible. The sagas slide us aboard all the time. Eric's saga Rauda puts women like Gudrid Thorbjarnar's Dotter on ocean crossings to Greenland and beyond, babies and all, which means the North Atlantic knew lullabies as well as war songs. Voyages pack odd combinations of people. A chieftain's son chasing silver, a widow riding to a new marriage, thralls roped to somebody else's future, a priest eyeing the horizon like a test, a steersman with a sunshadow ring, and the attitude of a sea god's nephew. When dusk drops the awning, Jald, and the deck becomes a patchwork of cloaks and rolled sail, bodies find edges of warmth the way cats do. Two hands meet under a shared pelt, maybe a promise, maybe just a truce against the cold. The boat doesn't care either way, it creaks the same. Quirky fringe fact glinting off the wave tops. Sailors in the north told stories of buying wind knots from magic workers, often saminoadi, cords tied with 3 special knots. Untie 1 for a breeze, 2 for a good push, 3 for a storm you'd better deserve. Is that sail receipt archaeology? Not really. But the tale pops up in Norse and later Nordic folklore like a gull that refuses to leave, and you can see why it stuck. On a dead calm sea, you'd pay for anything that felt like a lever on the sky. Some crews pinned little amulets to the shrouds, just in case the wind admired jewellery. You navigate with sun, stars, bird flight, watercolour, whale tracks. You also navigate people. The rule is unspoken but iron. No fights the ship can't survive. That includes jealousy. At sea, envy is a hole in the hull, it pulls everyone down equally. So when 2 pairs of eyes start finding each other with embarrassing accuracy, the steersman suddenly needs more volunteers to check the lashings aft, and the priest rediscovers the spiritual value of keeping busy. If someone won't be subtle, the older hands will be subtle for them, separate of watches, separate benches, a lot of helpful errands that involve opposite ends of a very long boat. There's an open, scholarly debate bobbing alongside all this, salt-stung and stubborn. How often did mixed-gender crews actually sail together? And what did that do to shipboard behaviour? Sagas and archaeological finds prove women travelled by sea, colonising to Iceland, Greenland and Vinland, visiting kin, trading, but were they routine on raiding craft or mostly on family and cargo voyages? Some scholars argue women aboard were common on migration legs and rare on war runs. Others think the line is blurrier, especially for coastal hops. Either way, the sources do not hand us a tidy rulebook for sea flirtations, which is exactly the point. The ocean teaches improvisation. Nights bring the hush that only wind can make. The aurora turns green lace over the mast, and somebody hums a half-song about a girl on a headland who promised to wait. The humming turns into a chorus. Tired, off-key, lovely. You curl into your cloak knowing a boat is the worst place to keep a secret. The plank you lean on might carry your heartbeat from bow to stern. Still, there are secrets here, small ones, a shared scrap of dried fruit, a whispered story, a hand squeeze when the swell hits weird. In a world where desire is forever measured, bartered and itemised, this feels like theft but gentle. Shipboard superstition polices desire, with a lighter touch than the law, but it's no less bossy. No boasting about what waits in port, the steersman says, because the sea hates promises. Don't whistle, you'll call winds you can't pay for. There's talk that Ran, the sea goddess with the net, likes gifts, a coin tossed, a ring, something shiny pressed into the water with 2 fingers and a please. That's insurance against falling overboard, but also against other kinds of snatching. If you've flirted too hard with someone who belongs to someone, you may want Ran to mind her own net for a while. Eating aboard is a romance killer anyway. Dried fish, hard bread, sour whey, cold mutton that tastes like a dare. The fire is a lidded box with more soot than flame. Cook smell clings to everyone equally. So if you're getting dreamy over anyone sent out here, congratulations, your kink is tar. Still, you'd be surprised how many glances get traded over a shared strip of smoked eel. Survival is an aphrodisiac with a terrible aftertaste. A tiny wry historical aside, personal space on a 20-30 metre hull is a myth, you tell landsmen. Sea chests are seats by day and pillows by night. Cloaks are doors you pretend to close. The deck is a single room, infinitely ventilated. And yet, you'll hear later on ashore about that couple, who must have found a shadow big enough for 2. Believe what you want. The truth is that desire at sea is mostly the art of accumulating small kindnesses, and saving them for later. Portside stables, lofts, borrowed corners where the ocean can't watch. On the 5th night out, fog moves in like a secret. The world shrinks to the mast tip and the breath in front of your face. People whisper automatically, as if the white could hear. Someone reaches for someone's hand and doesn't let go for an hour. Not from passion, but because the fog breeds thoughts you don't want surfacing alone. Later, on a clearer night, 2 shadows under the awning shift a little closer than before. The ship notes it and decides not to care as long as the sheets are trimmed and the bailers bail. Another fringe detail for your pouch. Some crew set up tiny house altars at the mast step, bits of green twig, a bead. A hacked-off piece of an arm ring rehearsal, offerings rotated like watch duties. You'll see, tucked there, the inevitable bead that looks like it once sat in someone's bodice, which says a lot about what people ask gods for at sea: speed, safety, and a reunion that isn't awkward. Then comes the squall, the sail drops, the oars bite, the boat turns into a living drum. Language shrinks to verbs: haul, brace, row. Desire does what it always does during a storm, it sits in the corner and waits. You tie yourself to the ship the way everyone else does. A line across the waist, a knot you can yank free if the hull rolls. The woman who was trading looks with the carver earlier now trades the bailer with him. They grin, feral, spray in their teeth. Survival is suddenly the only pair bond that counts. When the squall passes, bounces, your world crisps. Stars appear where there weren't any. People loosen their shoulders and realise they're starving. The priest mutters a thank you that is half Latin and half honest relief. The steersman pretends he wasn't worried. Someone produces a little hoard of hazelnuts and shares them like relics. Two palms brush again under a cloak, this time an "are you okay" touch, and you can feel the boat bless it. Not church bless, ship bless, a temporary sanctity awarded for getting through a bad patch without screaming. The debate resurfaces with the dawn, as debates do. Were ships stricter than halls about sexual rules? Some say yes, discipline keeps boats afloat, so captains forbade anything that might sour tempers. Others point at saga moments where flirtation sails right alongside the crew, unremarked except when it trips a feud that then gets postponed until landfall, because nobody is foolish enough to turn a jealousy into a man overboard. The evidence is slippery as fish. The best we can say is that the sea teaches triage. Urgent: storms, leaks, lost wind. Not urgent: your feelings. Urgent later: your feelings. By the time the coastline heaves up, a low line of dark, then cliffs, then a river mouth that smells like mud and promise. You've memorised the breathing of everyone around you. Land brings secrets into focus. Whatever began on deck will either dissolve in the bustle of ropes and carts or step ashore and try to grow legs. Most don't. Some do. You watch two people exchange the kind of look that means not done, and you file it with the other curios you've collected out here. Wind knots, mast alters, fog that teaches hand-holding. The ship eases into the shallows. Men hop to the gunwales. Poles bite bottom, and the hull glides the last stretch with that smug, sliding hush. Someone tosses a coin to Rand just in case. The awning comes down, your feet meet sand, weirdly tall after days of deck crouch. In a moment, this boat will be trade again, bales and barrels, lists and loud voices, but you carry ashore a quieter inventor. A promise tucked into a palm, a hunger postponed, a story you'll never tell straight. At sea, desire learns to whisper and to wait. It learns the patience of knots and the ethics of not making waves unless you mean the kind that move a ship. And sometimes, when the wind is easy and the night is kind, it learns a little about mercy, the kind that looks like two people sharing a cloak because the world is too wide not to. The port wakes like a beehive someone kicked, ropes creak, gulls scream, cartwheels groan on wet planks, and everywhere hands are counting something. The air smells like brine, tar, fish, guts, and a dozen spices offloaded from ships that sailed warmer seas. It's here, in this jostle of barrels and baskets, that the Viking Age reveals one of its sharpest truths. Desire isn't only for people. It's for goods, for Sylvia, for status, and all three could be traded in the same breath. Ports are matchmaking arenas as much as they're markets, but here the matches are between households, guilds, and whoever can offer the best mix of bodies and coin. You step off the ship into a knot of trade talk that sounds almost like courtship. I'll give you 3 measures of salt for your wool, and throw in a barrel of herring. What if I sweeten it with a bolt of silk? The language of haggling and the language of flirting share a rhythm. Offers, counter-offers, promises of quality. The difference is that in port the final deal might involve shipping a niece to marry a partner's son, or hosting a trader for a winter, where his presence in your hall is half business, half social manoeuvre. Grounded historical fact: Norse ports like Kaupang, Hedeby, and later Bergen were magnets for long-distance trade, drawing merchants from the Frankish realms, the Baltic, and even the Abbasid Caliphate. Excavations at Hedeby have turned up Islamic silver coins alongside Baltic amber and Rhineland glassware. These were not just goods, they were status markers. Owning an Abbasid dirham said you were connected to roots stretching into the heart of Asia. In marriage negotiations, Being the person who could supply such treasures made you more than eligible. It made you indispensable. The goods weren't just traded for their own sake, they were signals in human arrangements. Fine cloth might be part of a dowry, a sword part of a mourning gift. Exotic spices could sweeten a wedding feast in a way that told everyone, this union brings the world to our table. The port, with its crush of accents and smells, was where such future gestures began, long before the bride and groom ever met. Quirky fact, archaeologists in Ribe found tiny lead models of shoes and cloaks, likely used as trade tokens or charms. Some were even carved with runes or designs suggesting they might have doubled as flirtatious gifts. A shoe for your journey, maybe, or a cloak for your shoulders. In a culture where practical goods were also intimate items, giving someone a token could blur the line between business and wooing. Today in the port, you watch two families negotiate over a stack of Irish linen and a young man who is apparently part of the package. The mothers talk over bolts of cloth, each praising her own side's industry and honesty. The fathers argue prices for barley and smoked fish. The young man stands there like a sheep in a spring flood, smiling politely and trying not to look at the girl perched on the cart behind her mother, who is very obviously sizing him up. The deal will end in silver, goods, and, if all goes to plan, a wedding before the next trading season. The open scholarly debate here is how formal these market marriages were. Some suggest that seasonal ports doubled as bride fairs, where meetings were orchestrated by families over trade tables. Others see these stories as later romanticised additions, arguing that while matches could be sparked here, the real contracts were hammered out back home in halls and at things to... What's clear is that ports brought strangers together in a way rural life rarely allowed, and strangers are the raw material of new alliances. Fringe detail. There are records, patchy but persistent, of women running their own stalls in these ports, especially widows and single traders. In some cases, a woman's skill in commerce could boost her marriage's value far more than her dowry. A widow who could bargain a shipload of stockfish into a fortune of cloth and silver was someone chieftains noticed. Saga heroines, like Ord the Deep-Minded, reflect this archetype. Wealthy, well-travelled, and entirely capable of steering her own fortunes. The port hum changes as the sun leans west. Sailors offload barrels of tar and bundles of walrus ivory, then vanish into alleys where the air smells of ale and roasted meat. These tavern-like houses are where another kind of bargaining happens, shorter term, less likely to be blessed by kin. In Viking port towns, sex work was part of the ecosystem, not hidden, but woven into the commerce that kept ships moving. Sailors spent silver here as much as on goods, and while saga writers rarely detail the practice, law codes occasionally nod to it in clauses about disputes over payment or injury. You pass one such alley and catch sight of a painted sign, red ochre in the shape of a key. A woman sits on the step, hair in a bright scarf, watching the crowd with eyes that flick past you like measuring scales. She doesn't call out. She doesn't need to. Her work is as much about listening as inviting. She might hear a name tonight that she'll tuck away for later, when a trader's wife comes looking for proof of something whispered. In a town where information is as valuable as silver, she sells both. Inside the market hall, the noise is thick enough to feel. A man from Gotland hammers on a small chest to prove its strength. A Sami trader holds up a bundle of reindeer hides. A boy balances a tray of dried fish over his head, calling prices. Somewhere in that din, a woman in a green cloak negotiates for a carved comb, the kind you've seen exchanged as love tokens. She asks for the maker's mark to be etched on the back, not because she needs it, but because the right name on a comb can mean the start of a story. The port is also where the rules loosen. A flirtation here doesn't carry the same weight as one at home. The crowd is transient, the witnesses scattered. That's why elders sometimes frown on letting youth roam the market alone. Too much room for private words in public chaos. But for those same youths, the port is freedom, a place where you can speak without a cousin or a servant leaning in to listen. Some of those port-born whispers make it all the way back inland, folded into the negotiations that follow. As the tide pulls out, ships rock against their moorings, and the crowd thins toward the taverns and guest houses. You catch the linen and young man family sealing their deal with handshakes, silver, and a shared drink. The girl glances at her future with a look that could be calculation or curiosity, hard to tell in the half-light. The boy smiles back like someone who doesn't yet realise his marriage was just traded alongside smoked fish. The port exhales. Torches blink on along the quay, gulls roost on the rigging, and the market smell softens into a mix of wood smoke and spilled ale. Tomorrow will bring new ships and new bargains, but tonight the deals are done. You walk the planks, listening to the mingled voices fade into doorways, thinking how in this world, desire and commerce are braided so tightly you can't always tell which one you're buying or selling. It starts as a joke in the mead hall. Someone slaps a man on the back and calls him the bride worth fighting over, and the whole table bursts into laughter. But as the night unspools, the joke doesn't fade. You begin to notice the glances aimed at him, the way a pair of high-status women angle themselves toward his bench. The sudden interest from a merchant's widow who's normally as reserved as a locked chest. It's rare here, but not unheard of, when men were the prize. In most sagas and law codes, women are the ones traded like silver and cattle. But power doesn't always follow the same road twice, and in households where women hold real wealth, widows, heiresses, chieftains' daughters, the rare, highly desirable man becomes a political asset in his own right. He might be an exceptional warrior, a landowner without heirs, or simply blessed with the kind of charisma that fills a hall. If you can claim him as husband, you claim whatever he carries with him: land, alliances, followers, and that ineffable thing called honour. Here's your grounded historical fact. In Iceland's sagas, men like Kjartan Olafsson in Laxdæla saga, or Gunnar Hamundarson in Njál saga are openly pursued by women of high status, sometimes with direct proposals. In these narratives, women can and do initiate marriage arrangements when the political and social payoff is worth it. Wealthy widows were especially positioned to choose a new partner without asking anyone's permission, and their choice could shift local power balances overnight. The hall tonight hums with that possibility. The man in question, let's call him Eric, has just returned from a trading voyage with chests of Frankish cloth and a ship that is not only intact but better rigged than when he left. He's young enough to be appealing, old enough to be proven and unmarried, which in this company is a rare and dangerous combination. Two sisters, both daughters of a powerful farmer, have been circling him all evening, each with her own strategy. The elder leans on subtlety, asking about his voyage, laughing at his driest jokes. The younger goes bold, slipping him a drinking horn herself instead of passing it through a servant. Quirky fact, in Norse poetry, it wasn't unusual for women to compose lausavisur, short impromptu verses to men they admired, though naming them outright could trigger trouble under defamation laws. One preserved example has a woman praising a man's skill so vividly that the implication is clear even without his name. A clever verse was both a gift and a test. If he responded in kind, the hall noticed. Tonight the competition doesn't stop with sisters. The merchant's widow approaches Eric, bringing with her not only the allure of maturity but the weight of her trading connections. A marriage to her would mean immediate wealth and influence far beyond the valley. The sisters' eyes follow her every move. Around them, the hall feels like a chessboard, where each glance, laugh or gift is a piece moved closer to checkmate. The open scholarly debate here is about agency, specifically how much actual choice high-status men had in these situations. Were they free to pick among suitors, or were they pressured by kin into the match that offered the best political advantage? Some historians point to saga episodes where men resist such matches, sometimes fatally. Others note that resisting the will of wealthy, determined women could be just as dangerous as rejecting an arranged match proposed by your own kin. A fringe detail from Sturlunga saga hints at just how far such rivalries could go. In one feud, the competition for a particular man's hand escalated into sabotage of his ships, ensuring he couldn't leave the district until he made a choice. Whether that detail is literal or literary, it underlines how the value of a desirable man could make him a prize worth scheming, or even wrecking property over. Back in the hall, Eric navigates the night with the caution of a man crossing thin ice. He accepts the horn from the younger sister, praises the weaving of the elder, and compliments the merchant's widow on her acumen in securing her latest shipment. He does not linger too long with any of them, which in itself is a statement. He's not ready to choose, and he wants everyone to know it. That buys him time, but it also keeps the competition alive. The atmosphere tightens when the skald is called to sing. The elder sister has clearly prearranged this. Her father nods to the poet, who launches into a song praising a man whose voyage brought wealth and honour to the district. The description is just specific enough that no one doubts who's meant. Eric smiles, but it's the sort of smile you wear when you've just been given a gift you can't politely return. The younger sister counters by leading him into a game of Hneftafl, a strategy board game whose unspoken message is, I can match you move for move. The merchant's widow plays a longer game. She leaves the hall early, but not before sending a servant to deliver a small gift, a silver coin stamped with a foreign king's pensiomeur, and a note suggesting he visit her house tomorrow to hear about its origin. In a society where gifts are often public, a private one like this carries more weight than the object itself. It's an invitation to a conversation no one else can witness. As the night winds down, the hall's gossip is thick enough to spread on bread. Some predict Eric will choose the elder sister for her steadiness. Others bet on the younger's boldness. A few whisper that the widow's offer is too tempting to refuse. Eric himself keeps his own counsel, but you can see the calculation in his eyes. Whoever he chooses will shape his life as much as any voyage or battle. You leave the hall with the sound of soft wages behind you. It's strange, you think, how easily the pattern can flip. Most of the time, women's futures here hinge on the men they can claim. Tonight, the air carries the rare scent of reversal, 3 powerful women each manoeuvring to win the man whose hand could anchor their next chapter. And in this place, that makes him as valuable and as contested as the richest dowry. The snow outside glows blue under the moon, but in the hall everything is amber and red, the kind of warmth that makes you forget the air beyond the door could slice your lungs. Tonight's talk drifts towards stories, some sharp with truth, some rounded by so many retellings they barely remember their own beginnings. It's the time of year for Draugr and witches, for heroes who wrestle trolls and wake up with suspicious scratches. But the story that makes the hall lean in isn't about monsters in the woods. It's about a woman said to weave spells into bedsheets, and the men who found themselves tangled in more than just wool. Her name, in the telling, changes with the storyteller. Sometimes she's a Volva, a seeress honoured and feared. Sometimes she's a farmer's widow with a loom and too much time. Either way, she's the one people whisper about when a man falls hard for a woman who should be far beyond his reach. The rumour says she works her thread with herbs ground fine into the wool. Celandine for boldness, thyme for luck, mistletoe for a spark that won't go out. The gift of her weaving isn't just a blanket, it's a push, a pull, a quiet hand on the back steering you towards someone you already want but haven't dared to touch. Grounded historical fact, the sagas do preserve hints of textile magic. In Eirik's Saga Rauda, the Volva Thorbjorg Litilvolva is dressed in a blue cloak lined with white cat's fur and carries a staff wrapped with brass, costume and tools tied directly to her craft. In Vatnsdala Saga, a woman weaves a shirt for a man and tells him it will protect him in battle. Whether these clothes were believed to carry love magic is less clear, but in Norse belief, the act of weaving could be a form of shaping fate itself, threads as stand-ins for human lives. The weaver in tonight's story isn't content with shaping battles. She takes commissions from women whose husbands have grown cold, from girls who want a particular man to notice them, even from mothers who want their sons matched well before a rival family swoops in. Payment isn't always in silver. Sometimes it's in gossip, sometimes in a promised favour. And the men who sleep under her work, well, they often wake with the kind of restless determination that sends them knocking on the right or wrong door before the week is out. Quirky fact, textile fragments from Viking graves sometimes show traces of plant dyes that also have aromatic or medicinal properties. Madder, woad, weld. While most of these were chosen for colour fastness, it's not impossible that certain scents carried extra meaning. Imagine bedding that smells faintly of herbs associated with midsummer fertility rites. Even if no spell was spoken, the message would be hard to miss. The open scholarly debate here centres on intent. Were these associations deliberate acts of magic, or are we reading supernatural meaning into what might have been ordinary craft and trade? Some scholars argue that in a culture where practical and mystical often overlapped, separating the two is impossible. What looks like a love charm could also be a fine blanket with nice-smelling dye. Others caution against assuming all craftswomen were sorceresses in disguise. A talented weaver could earn a reputation for magic simply because her work coincided with a fortunate turn in someone's life. The fringe detail that makes the hall laugh tonight. One version of the story says the weaver's most famous blanket ended up in the wrong household entirely, delivered as a wedding gift to a man she'd never met. Within a month he'd left his bride for a woman 3 farms over, claiming he'd dreamed of her every night since the wedding. The abandoned wife burned the blanket in her yard, and the smoke was said to smell like both roses and rotten eggs, depending on who was telling it. You glance around and notice the real weavers in the hall listening with unreadable faces. They know how much work it takes to make a blanket, how many hours of carding, spinning, dyeing, weaving. They also know that once something leaves your loom, it carries whatever stories people decide to stitch to it. A fine piece of cloth can be proof of skill, a political gift, a trade commodity, or, in the right mouth, a dangerous piece of magic. As the night deepens, the storyteller leans in. She never married, he says of the weaver, but she never lacked for company. A few people chuckle, a few nod as if that explains everything. The idea that someone could move the affairs of the heart without ever stepping into the marriage market themselves is both unsettling and thrilling in this society. Control is power, and the weaver's loom, if the tale is to be believed, was a quiet throne, the fire pops sending sparks up into the smoke hole, and you can almost smell the imagined herbs in the air. In a world where desire is often hammered into contracts and witnessed at the thing, the notion that it could be coaxed, twisted, or redirected by a single pair of hands working in wool feels both impossible and inevitable. After all, if fate itself can be woven, why not love? When the story ends, someone tosses a folded blanket at a friend and says, "Better check that for spells." The hall laughs. But you notice more than one person running a hand over their bedding when they get home, as if feeling for something hidden in the weave. It might just be warmth, or it might be a thread you didn't know was there, pulling you quietly toward whatever, or whoever the weaver had in mind. The snow hushes the valley to a secret, the sky so clear it rings, and you're walking a path you probably shouldn't know, across a frozen stream, through a stand of black spruce, up toward a farm whose dogs would gladly turn your calves into riddles if they catch your scent. Your breath steams, your heart drums. It's the wrong path for a friendly visit, and that's the point. Tonight you're crossing an invisible border, the kind that isn't on any map but lives in every mouth. Enemy land. Your feet crunch a rhythm that says what your mouth won't. You're going to meet someone you shouldn't be meeting. 2 settlements sit within shouting distance, and they've been trading hard looks for 3 winters now. One argument about haying rights, another about a boundary stone that moved itself, as boundary stones mysteriously do, and the latest about a stray cow that wandered, bred where she shouldn't, and dragged half the valley into calculating calf ownership like it was theology. Everyone knows the feud's silly, and everyone knows it's deadly, and both can be true. In halls like these, pride is a forest fire kept in a box. All it needs is a story with a spark. And the story you're contemplating? Oh, it's a torch. It's not like the sagas didn't warn you. They're a whole library of don't told like lullabies. Still, the heart has its strange courage. Think of Gudrun and Kjartan there, and Bolli in Laxdela saga. Affection braided with loyalty until the rope turned into a noose. Think of the smaller tales told in corners after mead. About a girl who baked an extra loaf for a boy from the wrong bench and hid it under a cloak. About a boy who carved a birch sliver with a name and slid it between the door planks of a rival's buyer. The sagas pretend to be coy about such things, but they hum with it. The tenderness that risks heat. Here's your grounded historical fact. Icelandic law in the early Commonwealth era, the stuff later written down in Gragas, made elopement and bride abduction actionable offences. A man who stole a woman from her kin owed compensation at best and blood at worst. The line between consensual elopement and abduction could be decided after the fact, by who stood behind whom at the thing and whose witnesses spoke louder. Cross-clan romance wasn't just taboo, it was structurally expensive. The law looked at it the way farmers look at out-of-season frost. Inevitable sometimes, but ruinous to any careful plan. You make the last drift and crouch by a turf wall. In the small dark between 2 outbuildings, a lamp winks the twice. Whale oil, narrow flame, the kind of light that can be snuffed with a pinched thumb if someone approaches. You slip around the corner and there she is, hood back, hair pulled into a single braid that swings like a bell rope. You don't touch at first. The cold is a curtain, and you stand on either side breathing in the same nowhere air. When you finally do reach out to... It's a practical gesture. You warm her fingers in your palm so she can feel them again. In a life like this, romance is kindness with chapped knuckles. She tells you the latest from her haul. Her father's calculating a match with a merchant's son, the kind whose hands are soft and clever with accounting, which is a kind of courage, sure, but not the kind that keeps wolves from the fold at night. She's not unkind about him, she's just not in love with him. You tell her what she already knows. Your kin would rather invite lightning inside than link the households while this feud's still on its feet. The two of you count again the handful of the ways this could work. They are laughably thin. Thin isn't the same as none. A quirky fringe thread threads the talk. Somebody's grandmother swore that once, long ago, two lovers on opposite sides of a feud exchanged spoons, carved from the same walrus rib, split, initials cut into the bowl horns, a charm to teach mouths to speak the same truth. It's not in the law codes, it's not in the Eddas. It's the sort of story grandmothers invent, because people need something small to hold when the big things won't budge. You've brought a spoon tonight, just in case myth and wood can agree to pretend they matter. When she laughs and pockets it, you feel like you've bribed fate with a trinket. Fate likes trinkets more than it admits. There's an open scholarly debate that would make a good bar fight if bars here weren't mostly halls with too many witnesses. How often were these forbidden loves real compared to how often they're literary devices? Some historians say the sagas inflate romance to glue listeners to the next bloodbath, that the enemy lovers motif is imported through broader medieval storytelling currents. Others point out that in thinly populated valleys where everyone is someone's cousin or creditor, crossbench attraction is statistically guaranteed. Law codes bristle with the category because life kept producing it. Add in fostering, you grow up in your rival's house for politics, winter markets, ports, opportunity is not rare. Paper, well, vellum, can romanticize. It can also report. The truth probably sits grinning between the two. You plan the only plan you have, foster a truce with a gift too tempting to refuse. The spring thing is coming. If your kin can be nudged into a cattle exchange big enough, and hers into a dowry that flatters without insulting, you might dig a shallow channel from blood to silver. Peace weaving is the old word, an old English one, Friothew Weber. But the job title exists here too, even if the term doesn't. Women tie clans together with marriages that tamp down sparks. The irony tastes like iron. To become peace, you must first be war's favourite rumour. Not that everyone believes in peace weaving. Some men mutter that marrying across a feud is like sheathing a knife in silk still sharp underneath. And there are the cautionary models: if you marry in, and someone dies under suspicious circumstances, your pillow becomes a witness stand. The hall will weigh every sigh you've ever made. Love is a word that melts fast under those eyes, but absence isn't safer. Refuse the match and the feud survives to raise your children. Choose it, and maybe your children learn new names for cousin. The calculus feels personal, the stakes are generational. She tells you about the little sister who sleeps nearest the door because she likes the cold. Translation, she's the best early warning system in the family. You tell her about your uncle's elbow that hasn't bent since a farm raid 20 years past. How he still carries firewood as if he's courting the pain on purpose. You're swapping trivia as camouflage for the real exchange. I might be worth the trouble. Are you? Are we? Those questions hang between you like breath that doesn't blow away. When she leaves first, you wait until the lampwink disappears, and then count to 300. Numbers like footprints back to caution. On the return path, the world sounds like it's made of leather and ice. Once, a fox barks. A high hiccup that makes you grin, because even foxes have gossip. You think about the way halls turn tiny acts into epics. A glance becomes an oath. A misplaced cloak becomes evidence. In this place, Percy, your private sentence is the community's favourite paragraph. Write carefully. Back at your bench, you lie awake and make lists. Who can be convinced? The chieftain's wife, always the hinge of the door, not its squeak. The priest, he'll sniff charity, the church's word for politics. The steersman who likes your family's fish and her family's timber. You never know which merchant will choose to be a diplomat if the price of rope drops. You're building a coalition out of appetites because that's how these things actually move. Romance is a spark. Logistics is kindling. You tuck one more detail into the coffer of oddities. In a few folktales later scribbled down, lovers across feuds arrange meetings by setting a lamp in a window with a shutter cut like a heart. No archaeology for hearts in shutters, just charm. But tonight, her little whale oil flame looked like it had a notch to it. A crescent cut by a knife tip to leak light sideways. Signal enough. In a landscape of dark, even a flawed circle can be a vow. The hard part comes with morning. You must live exactly as if nothing is different, while quietly changing everything. You speak moderately at the breakfast bench. You make an extra joke at the wrong cousin's expense to keep suspicions drowsy. And when the talk turns, as it always does, to the outrageous greed of that other farm, you shrug in the correct rhythm. Later you ferry a message that isn't a message to someone who knows how to turn not a message into a ledger entry, and that's how a pathway gets paved. One plausible deniability at a time. Spring will test you. The snow will rot from underneath. The roads will turn to porridge. Men will unearth grievances like old roots. And every promise will need a witness. But the nights will also ease. The lamps will burn longer without smoking so. Someone will sing a song that mentions a river crossing and doesn't end in murder. Someone might even say, softly, casually, as if it hardly matters, that 2 farms are sitting again, and here are 2 cows to prove it. You fall asleep eventually, the way tired conspirators do, mid-sentence, still counting angles. In your palm under the blanket, a spoon warms. In some other house, a pocket holds its twin. Between them, a valley full of old anger and new work. Between them, one precise chance to turn an enemy line into a family line so slowly that nobody hears the click. By the next evening, the hall feels like a throat clearing. People settle with the expectant quiet that comes before a good story. Chests propped as backrests, cups within a lazy reach, fire drowsing rather than roaring. You can tell someone's about to sing your secrets back to you with prettier words and sharper edges. That's what the saga men do. They take nights like last night, lamps in shutters, spoons in pockets, breath held under enemy roofs, and turn them into tales that make the hair rise and the neighbours nod, even as the truth curls itself into a ball and rolls under the bench. The school takes the far stool, fingers the harp, and starts with one of those opening lines that taste like smoke and snow. There was a man named... You know him already. The way someone knows a portrait that's been retouched 3 times. He's bolder than he was in life. She's either purer or colder, depending on the copyist. The feud is cleaner, the choice is starker, the lamp brighter. Stories are good at polishing. And the Viking age you live in is a world constantly being polished by people who were never there, and by people who were there but are now writing in a later light. Here's your grounded historical fact. Most of the sagas we lean on, Njal's saga, Laxdæla saga, Egil's saga, the Sturlunga compilation, were written down in 13th century Iceland, generations after the era they describe. They are filtered through Christian scribes, a changed legal order, and a different sense of sin. Manuscripts like Mudravalabok and Hauksbok are treasures, yes, but they're not microphones in a Viking longhouse. They're memory set to parchment by people who have opinions about you. That doesn't make them lies, it makes them literature with a long echo. Watch how the Scald handles the bedroom. He won't say sex, not straight. He'll talk about shared furs, a night spent at a byre, a bed visited, or a blanket laid. He's a master of not naming the thing, of laying door frames around it so you can walk in yourself. The sagas absorb desire by writing around it. Doors, thresholds, sheets, glances, and the kind of compound words that sound like a room clearing its throat. Skaldic verse adds kennings to the dodge. Suddenly bodies are ships. Beds are fields, love is rowing, or the meeting of mornings. You get the picture without the picture. Quirky fact, sometimes scribes couldn't resist drafting their own commentary in the margins. Little hands pointing at lines, faces peering at paragraphs, occasional doodles that look suspiciously like someone got bored during a genealogy. Icelandic manuscripts aren't as crammed with prancing snails and rude monks as some continental books, but you do find oddities, tiny ships, ornamented beasts, and the occasional nota bene finger wagging at a spicy verse. A few later paper copies quietly replace bold nicknames with polite ones or drop a stanza altogether, as if a nun with a broom had swept a corner of the page. You hear your own valley in the sagaman's voice, and don't. The romance that's been creeping along your fence lines appears in his telling as a clean dilemma. Honour or love, feud or peace. He gives the lovers speeches you wish you could have delivered in one breath. He trims out the logistics, the priest's fee, the steersman's rope price, the cousin whose grudge needs the 3 extra cows, because epics hate receipts. He expands the look that took a heartbeat into 3 lines of poetry because epics love eyes. If the pair survive, it's because the gods or God willed it. If they fail, it's because fate has a flair for drama. Meanwhile, the real fate that moved your lives, silver, timing, witnesses, winks at you from behind the words. You can taste the censorship as clearly as the salt on dried fish. Adultery in the sagas sometimes ends with outlawry or a spear, and sometimes with a quiet, "So that's how that went," depending on whether the author wants to tug you toward a moral or a mystery. Thrall's stories vanish into passive phrases. He took her, she bore him a son, as if agency were a wormhole that swallows grammar. The law's mess, fines, half-confessions, conditional settlements, gets streamlined into verdicts that satisfy an audience in one paragraph. The trial of the bedframe becomes a scene with hand-picked witnesses and a single decisive glance. Your longhouse lived in the grey. Parchment loves black and white. There's an open scholarly debate, the kind that keeps conference coffee hot. How far can we lean on sagas to reconstruct real Viking social and sexual practice? One camp argues they preserve a backbone of memory, habits, norms, rhythms, even if the rhetoric is 13th century. Another camp says the sagas project later Christian values backward, especially around marriage, divorce, concubinage and same-sex slander, cleaning the earlier age with a pious cloth. A third group camps in the middle, claiming you can triangulate truth by cross-checking sagas with law codes like Gragas, archaeology, beds, runesticks, isotopes, and foreign chronicles. Your hall would approve of the middle camp, it likes witnesses. The skald slips into verse and everyone leans in. The stanza is careful, no mansongvar here that could be read as naming and shaming. You remember from earlier nights how erotic poems could draw lawsuits. The ghost of that law still hovers over the fire. So the verse skates right up to the line, calls a cloak a night river, a hand a tide mark, and leaves the room to do the rest. A few people grin, a few check whether any fathers are frowning. The beauty of language here is that it's a key with many teeth. Each listener's mind picks a different lock. Backstage, you know the real ways stories mutate. A priest helps a copy by softening a coarse joke. A chieftain's descendant corrects a scene that makes great-grandfather look petty. A scribe tired at midnight skips a line and never notices. A later reader supplies widow, where the original said woman, nudging a liaison from scandal into acceptability. A verse about a visit gets swapped with one about a vow, changing a night into a promise. That's not malice, it's the long slope of memory. The slope always tilts toward the present. A small fringe fact the skald would never admit on stage. Whole sagas we wish we had. Skjoldunga saga, a chunk of Heidarviga saga, parts of Njala, in lost versions, survive only as summaries or quotes in later books. When a summarist disapproves of a bedroom scene, he doesn't always say so. He just forgets to mention it. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Norse world, literal phallic graffiti and saucy runic scraps survive in dirt where no censor's quill could reach. The earth kept what the page declined. Your mind drifts back across the earlier episode like beads on a cord. The bride price weighed like a ransom. The Gragas choreography at door, bed and boundary. The thrall girl's quiet testimony. The runesticks with their carved ache. The priest's bell that turned some sins private and others public. The saga voice turns each of those into something arranged just so. It's good for the night, you think. Whether it's good for the record is another question. But tonight isn't court, it's company. Let the tale be lovely and a little wrong. You'll handle the ledger tomorrow. One old woman, the kind who counts winters by how many babies she's midwifed, snorts softly when the skald grants his lovers a clean escape. Must be nice, as she says into her cup. She isn't correcting the story, she's putting a footnote on it. This is how truth survives under poetry. In the murmurs, the side-eyes, the half-heard you can almost see future scribes peering through time, catching only the verse and missing the snort. Pity. The snort is the truest line of the night. The skald closes with the sort of ending a hall likes. Snow melting, feud cooling, baby born with a suspiciously diplomatic dimple. The applause is palms on wood, soft and satisfied. People want the world to cohere for the length of a tale. Who doesn't? The danger is when the clean arc bleeds back into life and convinces someone to ignore the messy, survivable compromise in favour of a gesture that looks good on parchment and a bad on a field. The sagas teach courage and cunning. They can also teach tidy tragedy. Handle with care. When the crowd breaks, the skald wipes his strings and drifts to the ale barrel. You catch him and ask, half teasing, if he's ever told a tale the way it happened. He smiles the tired, honest smile of a craftsman. Often, he says, and no one believes those. You both laugh. It's the most accurate line of the night. Truth here is a bird that lands on your wrist for a heartbeat, then lifts off for the rafters. The page catches a feather and calls it the bird. You stretch out on your bench, eyeing the smoke hole where a star refuses to blink. The room smells like resin and wool and a little like ink, impossible. but you smell it anyway, the future's breath reaching backward. If the saga about your valley gets written, you know what will happen to your spoon charm, your lamp notch, your 300 count. They'll be edited into a single sign from fate, smoothed and glowing. Fine, keep one spoon for yourself, put the other on the page so people have something to touch. Outside, the snow sifts down as patient as ash. Inside, words settle into people the same way. You sleep in a world where the law counts. The priest notes, the rune sliver whispers, and the saga sings. None cancels the others. They overlap like furs on a winter bed, warmth made from layers and gaps. If you wake in the night, you'll hear the Scald quietly trying a new ending under his breath. Don't worry, he'll still leave enough space for you. Spring comes on like someone lifting the lid on the world, snow collapsing into rivulets, frost sighing out of the ground, roofs dripping until the mud under the eaves is the colour and smell of strong coffee. The longhouse door stands open more often now, and the air inside smells less like smoke and more like thawed earth. It's the season when people remember grudges in detail again. Winter's indoor civility melts right along with the ice, but it's also the season for putting those grudges to the test, and for arranging marriages that have been simmering all winter in cups of mead and whispered speculation. Your own speculation is about to meet the thing, both the capital T outdoor assembly and the small T thing that's been pacing the inside of your rib since that night in the snow. Every district sends its men, women, traders, priests and storytellers to the field. It's part parliament, part fair, part court and part open-air gossip chamber. In a society without permanent central government, the thing is where laws are recited, disputes settled, alliances sealed, and, quietly, matches made. Everyone comes dressed for the weather and for the politics. Grounded historical fact, the Althing in Iceland, founded in 930 CE, was both legislative and judicial, but smaller local things dotted the Norse world. Quarter courts, local assemblies, seasonal markets with law speakers. The thing site would often be a natural amphitheatre or flat field near water, marked with a logberg, law rock, from which the laws were spoken. Attendance wasn't just for men. Saga evidence and legal provisions show that women could be present, especially if they were directly involved in disputes or property matters. The thing field was a place to be seen. This year's thing has all the trappings: traders hawking bright-dyed cloth from a tarp, farmers showing off new lambs in wicker pens, smiths selling spearheads and sickles side by side. There's a ring of stalls selling bread so fresh the steam curls like it's showing off, and a group of children daring each other to touch the cold iron of the blacksmith's anvil. And there, beyond the tented stalls, the long row of benches where disputes will be aired and settled, unless they can be bargained into something quieter first. Quirky fact, at some things, young people treated the gathering a bit like a modern festival, wandering between tents, joining games, exchanging small gifts. In the Orkneys, later tradition speaks of hand-fasting at Lammas fairs, where couples pledge themselves for a year and a day. While that specific practice isn't documented in Viking Age Iceland, gatherings like the Thing were among the few opportunities for young adults from different settlements to meet outside of kin-controlled contexts. That freedom was tempting and dangerous depending on whose eyes were watching. You spot her across the field, the braid catching sun, her tunic hemmed dark with mud. She's flanked by kin, of course, but the current in her glance says the same thing it did the night by the shuttered lamp. This is the one chance. You weave your way there not directly but circuitously, greeting mutual acquaintances, lingering just long enough with a mutual cousin to make the next step seem casual. The small talk is all about weather and lambing, until her kin's attention drifts to a trader selling beeswax, and then you're side by side at the edge of the pen with the year's first calf between you, chewing like it knows the plot. This is the window. You speak in the language of livestock exchange, which in this culture is almost as coded as poetry. Your father breeds them calm. Your uncle's pasture is rich. A fair trade's worth more than a quick one. Every line can be read as about cattle, or about people. You think she hears both readings. The corner of her mouth says so. The open scholarly debate about such meetings is whether subtlety like this was actually noticed by the assembly at large, or whether we imagine more scrutiny than existed. Some historians argue that, with dozens of disputes and trades happening, a quiet flirtation could pass largely unremarked. Others point out that in small societies, the thing was as much about watching as deciding, and any repeated proximity between two young people from rival families would be catalogued for future leverage. The truth probably depends on the size of the thing and the appetite for scandal in the crowd. The formal part of the day begins with the law speaker standing at the Logberg, reciting statutes in a voice that carries over sheep bleats and market calls. You hear the familiar passages about land rights, ship maintenance, injury fines, and marriage law. That last bit, recited without flourish, still lands like a drum in your chest. Everyone here knows who's of marriageable age, who's widowed with land. Deals will be made before the tents come down, and those deals will start with a smile or a sentence that may already have been spoken. By midday, the field smells of trampled grass, horse sweat, and grilling meat. You and she cross paths again near the stalls selling carved combs and horn spoons. The spoons make you both smirk. You can't speak openly, but you don't need to. In this place, a smirk can be a paragraph. A merchant interrupts, praising the smoothness of his wares, and you buy one without haggling. It's a risk to take it from his hand to hers in view of others, but you do it, the gesture small enough to be deniable, big enough to be remembered. Fringe detail. Some Icelandic law allowed for a marriage to be contracted at a thing if both parties' kin were present and agreed, with witnesses to the betrothal and a set bride price. That meant a match could be sprung on the crowd without months of lead-up if the right people were in the mood to settle matters quickly. In sagas, this often happens after a feud settlement, peace sealed not just with silver but with a person, and that's what you're aiming for. Late in the day, when the two groups meet to talk over the cattle dispute that's been standing like a stone between you, you place yourself where you can nod in agreement at the right moment, where your smile can be read as a sign of goodwill instead of victory. Her father weighs the terms, your uncle leans on his staff, and slowly the shape of the bargain emerges: livestock grazing rights, and, tucked into the edge like a quiet footnote, the possibility of a marriage that would make the whole thing stick. You feel the shift in the air before anyone says it. Her glance meets yours, and it's not the look of someone stealing a moment. It's the look of someone about to be named in front of the law rock. The Skalds will write this differently, of course. They'll make it a bold leap, a single act of passion that turned war to wedding. But you know the truth. It was a winter of coded spoons and counted heartbeats, of learning how to stand in the same field without drawing blood. This is just the part where the ink dries. By the time the sun sinks low and the air picks up its evening bite, the deal is done in all but words. Tomorrow, they'll recite it aloud, measure the bride price, and set the date. Tonight, the two of you will walk the edge of the field like strangers who happen to be going the same way, talking about the weather and the grazing, because that's the safest way to carry something fragile into the open. And now the fires in the longhouses are burning lower, the voices turning softer, the mead cups resting half forgotten on the benches. You've walked with me through the icy fjords and muddy market squares, across deck planks slick with salt and into halls where words could be more dangerous than swords. You've seen marriages weighed like silver on a merchant's scale, and you've stood in the hush between two feuding farms where a lamp's flicker meant more than a letter ever could. We've sifted through the sagas, those careful polished mirrors that reflect as much about the tellers as about the age they claim to show. We've peeked at the laws that turn desire into clauses and fines, at the rituals that dressed love in fur and oath, and at the sly little charms worked into cloth or carved on bun spoons. We've seen how the sea could tighten bonds as easily as it tangled hair, and how the thing could be both courtroom and matchmaker's stall. And always, we've balanced between the record and the rumour, the way history itself does when no one's looking. The dark truth of things in the Viking Age wasn't one truth at all. It was a weave of many threads. Politics knotted it into passion, survival braided into the seduction, law stitched into love. For some it was a chain, for others, a rope thrown across the gap between two lives. And for those who lived in its shadow it could be both, switching without warning. So as you let the last of the fire's heat fade into the night, picture the quiet after the saga is told. The hall settling into sleep, the dogs curling against the door, the frost forming on the beams overhead. Somewhere in that stillness a truth waits, not polished for an audience, not trimmed for a law room, but the truth as it felt in the chest of someone who lived it. That's the one we'll never write down exactly, but maybe if you listen closely you can still hear it breathing. Sweet dreams.